Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It's time for weekly reviews. We are finally back into the regular season, this time in 2024, and we get to kick it off with week 1 of the LEC Winter Split. I'm so excited to get back into the format, to get back into the grind of covering League every single day, basically, on this channel for all 4 major regions as well as the NACL, and we get to kick it off with Europe this year. It's not China starting first. It is Europe that's going to be kicking off our year, and I'm very, very excited to go over week number 1. If you guys are excited as well, let me know down in the comments section below. If you are new to the channel, what we do here, if you maybe, joined for the primers, or maybe you found this video just through YouTube recommended, first of all, hello, how are you doing? What we do is go through all 15 games in the LEC in week number 1, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I give a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of the week, I give a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. This is also a power rankings video. If you want to know my power rankings going into week number 1, you can check out my LEC primer video that I did about a week ago, up in the iCard right now, to kind of give you an idea of just how I feel about all the teams moving into the season. Spoiler alert, this has probably been one of my more successful predictions in a while. A lot of the teams that I really went out on a limb for and said that I felt very good about ended up doing well, and a lot of the teams that I kind of went out on a limb in a negative way ended up doing poorly, and so I feel pretty good about the primer, but we'll have to kind of, figure that out as we go further along into the video. At the end of the video, when we go over everything, I will be updating my power rankings with everything that, I believe after week number 1, but with all that intro business, I guess, out of the way, it is time to jump into the analysis. Like I said, we're going to be going through all 3 days, all 15 games here in week number 1, talking about, where these teams went right and wrong, and that means we get to start it off with game number 1, and the game that kicked off our 2024 Winter Split in the LEC was G2 Esports taking on Team BDS, and G2 was able to pick up the win in the first game of the split. Really nice win for them here. Obviously, I'm very high on G2. I think a lot of other people are very high on G2. You could make an argument that they are top 1 or 2 in every single role across the board, and especially with the LEC, I don't want to say getting worse across the board, but, certainly the salary cap had an impact on team building in the offseason, basically every team having to make a concession somewhere on the map. For G2 to be able to run back this roster was insane, and honestly, they showed their prowess in this game number 1. It wasn't exactly a perfect game from start to finish, but it was pretty darn close. It was very, very good from them. They lost a little bit in the early game. I do want to, kind of point that out. Early game was actually very in favor of BDS, but that's what you would kind of expect when you see the very aggressive, very, lane-dominant team comp that BDS ended up drafting. You pick the Renekton and the Nocturne on the top side of the map. You pick the Kalista Pike on the bottom side of the map. It just opens up a lot of opportunities for you to play a lot more aggro in the early game, and G2 didn't necessarily have a lot of ways to answer that in terms of team comp. They did fall a bit behind, especially in some isolated 1v1, specifically top lane, but it didn't really matter. Once they got to the mid to late game, this team comp was just a lot more versatile in terms of how they could initiate, start, and end fights, quite frankly, and G2 was able to outplay them in the mid to late game, and that ended with a G2 win. I think they definitely played better in this game. They knew the win con of the comp that they ended up drafting, and they played it slow and steady, and they ended up just being able to take it relatively simply. Player of the game for me is going to go to Caps in the mid lane. Felt pretty good about this one. He was the player that I think played the best across the entirety of the game. I think realistically you could give this to Broken Blade because he was the most influential carry in the back half of the game. During the late team fights, this Gwen was legitimately unkillable. Worth noting that the patch that LEC is playing on for week number 1 is pre-hotfix on Gwen, which means that she is still pretty crazy, and that obviously we're going to see some interesting builds on her, but, Gwen ended up hitting that power spike eventually, but I thought without the Nico, without Caps in this game, it actually does become a lot harder for G2 to win, even if he wasn't necessarily carrying in terms of the damage every single fight. I just think he was playing really solid across the entirety of this game. Nico is a pick that we're going to see a lot throughout this week, especially into things that are aggressive like Akali, because it does shut down a lot of the just dive potential of Nocturne, Akali, Pike, Renekton, and, I think Caps did a really good job of utilizing that role. A lot of people have been low on Caps going into this split. I was kind of there. Like, I'm lower on him than I was like 4 years ago, but I still think he's the best mid laner in the LEC, and I think this was a very good performance to show that. He didn't have to shine, he didn't have to be the star. He could just silently very much be the one that was shutting down basically everything BDS wanted to do. But like I said, Broken Blade also deserves some credit for being able to carry the back half of the game. He did lose top lane pretty hard in the early game, which is pretty expected in this matchup, but Gwen is inevitable, at least on the current patch. I would expect to see her banned a lot more consistently. I don't expect to see her picked up, and Broken Blade definitely outplayed Adam as this game continued to go on. There was a fight in the mid game that really went Broken Blade's way and really kind of shifted the game in favor of G2 just in general. Yike was definitely the better jungler. Hans and Mickey were fine in this one, but I think this was more of a team effort. I would honestly argue that G2 won this game more off the back of macro than any individual outplays. They were just a much more I guess, disciplined team in this game. They knew what they needed to do. They knew their win condition, and they played towards that, and they simply just did that better than BDS, and I think they earned the win because of it. And then with BDS on the other side, you know, there are some advantages, there are some positives to talk about here. I do think that the aggressiveness that they showed in draft is a positive. I know some people are going to look at this and say, like, well, you're not going to be able to get away with this against a team like G2, against one of the better teams in the league. And while that might be true, I at least like them being able to say, like, we trust ourselves to win early, and we trust our ability to snowball the game out of control. It didn't end up happening, and it didn't end up working out because they took some bad fights, especially in the mid game, but at least they were able to show that, you know, if they're given positive matchups, they are able to generate some leads. Specifically, the top lane was really good before 10 minutes. It really started to devolve after 10 minutes. Adam did not have a very good back half of this game, but that's kind of what you expect with Renekton into Gwen. And then my dead of the game is going to go to Sheo in the jungle on this Nocturne. It just felt like he was consistently creating fights that didn't need to be created. We were talking about G2 being very disciplined and knowing how to play to their win condition. It didn't really feel like the same could be said about Sheo and about BDS, where the Nocturne was just taking a lot of fights that were very in favor of G2. Basically, every time he pressed ultimate, it was in favor of the other side, and that's not really something that you want to see. I do like the aggressiveness. I like the aggression and the willingness to try and go in and make plays, try to be able to win the game. I just think it was a bit too much. Top side of the map ended up just getting outscaled so hard in this game, and BDS really didn't have a way to come back. But honestly, I'm not frustrated with BDS. This is them going up against the best team in the league. They were underdogs in this game. They drafted a super aggro comp just to try to win as quickly as possible, and it didn't end up working out. There are worse ways to lose your first game of the split, but we will need to see them be able to bounce back. You know, these weeks are long. They're 3 games, 3 days long. Losing on day 1 isn't the worst thing in the world. If you can bounce back, you just need to be better on days 2 and 3. And then for G2, it always is good to start off your year with a win, but it is just one win. This is a very telling win in my opinion, because it does show that this G2 team has improved their macro a bit. It was something they struggled with towards the end of last year, especially once they got onto the bigger stage, and so it's nice to see them, you know, pick a comp that just needs to scale and not overexert themselves, not, you know, put themselves into bad positions in order to try and change the game state, you know, quicker than it needs to be changed. This was just a generally good game, in my opinion, from G2 Esports, and I think they're going to be happy with the week 1 win. And then moving on to game number 2 of day 1, and this was a matchup between two teams that I grouped together in my primer video. It's SK Gaming taking on Rogue, number 6 and 7 in my power rankings respectively, and SK Gaming was able to pick up a pretty big win here and a pretty dominant win. They were in control the entirety of this game from moment 1, and this is the aggression that I was talking about. This is, you know, not as much of an all-in comp as what BDS had drafted the previous game, but I think aggression is going to be rewarded this split and on this patch in not only the LEC, but across the entirety of the world, and I think we kind of saw that in this game number 1 here for SK Gaming. You know, selfishly, a bit happy to see the SK win here because I did pick them as my underdog, you know, breakout team of the split in my primer video. I kind of talked about them as the team that I think everybody was sleeping on a lot more than I think they should be. I think Niski has been great everywhere he's gone. Exakik and DOS are a really good bot lane and one that I think will kind of break out a bit this year. And if Isma is good, then I think SK could be a very, very good team because we know Irrelevant is solid on the top side. But even I couldn't have predicted as strong of a start to the split as they had, at least in game number 1 here, because this was awesome. This is the kind of fast-paced, you know, very much game plan-oriented style that I really wanted to see from SK. It really felt like they had a good idea of how they wanted to attack Rogue's weaknesses, and they went about doing so in a very easy and solid way. Player of the game for me was actually pretty up for debate, because I think there were 2 players in particular that played awesome, but I'm going to give it to Isma in the jungle for his debut, his first ever game in the LEC, and it goes pretty darn good on the Xin Zhao. This is the kind of performance that you really want to see out of a rookie. I know a lot of people people are going to give a lot of credit to Irrelevant, and he deserves it. He did carry the game in the back half because, once again, Gwen is ridiculously strong, and I think the teams that have realized that a lot quicker on this patch are going to be able to do a lot better, a lot quicker. You know, we'll talk about Shigenda in a second, but blind picking Aatrox with Gwen still up in this meta is just not the play. It is just never going to be the play, but I think a lot of people are also going to give credit to Niski because he is this kind of jungle whisperer, and, you know, obviously he deserves it, but let's give credit to Isma. This is what he was doing in the ERLs as well. This is what he was doing for Movistar last year, as he was creating a lot of action in the early game, being super aggro, setting up kills for his laners on really, you know, strong engaged junglers or diving junglers like the Xin Zhao, and he basically just translated that exactly into the LEC in game number 1 here, and that's exactly what you want to see. Again, he is kind of the piece of this team that if he is good, if he is as good as he, you know, can be, or I think he can be, this could actually genuinely be a top 3, top 4 team in the LEC, you know, right now. And that's really, really fun to say because it's been a long time since SK has been as relevant as I think they could be this split. But Irrelevant, you know, ironically enough, the pun was certainly not intended, but very funny how I made that transition. Irrelevant was awesome in this game, and he just continues to be amazing. I honestly probably undersold him a bit in the primer. I talked about him as this super consistent, super solid top laner, but he might even be better than that. He might be like genuinely the best top laner in the region, or one of the best top laners in the region. He was dominant in this game. It's worth noting he had a phenomenal matchup. He got to play the best champion on the patch into a counter pick matchup, and so it certainly wasn't the hardest opportunity for him to be able to win, but still, for him to be able to come out and dominate in the late game like he was able to do, if the top side of the map is going to be this good, they were the members I was, quite frankly, the most concerned about, in the sense of, if this team's going to be elite, these players need to play elite. Isma and Irrelevant need to play elite, because I really trust that Niski, Exakick, and DOS are going to be good enough to be able to make that work. To see those two be the ones to step it up in game number 1 and really be the ones to push SK forward, that's a really good sign, and this is a really good win. And then for Rogue, this is a concerning loss. Again, it's only one game, and the last thing I want to do is overreact. Honestly, I pride myself on this channel of being a lot more level-headed, of trying to find the middle ground, the gray, in a sea of black and white coverage that you're going to get on social media for a lot of these other games, but this is concerning. I would be lying if I said that this was not a game that did, you know, worry me a bit. Larson kind of got run over in the mid lane. He has been a bit of a stable presence, you know, for this team. There was a reason he ranked so high in my mid lane rankings, not because he is this dominant carry player, because he really isn't, but because it seems like every single game is the same for him. He does fine in lane, and then he's really good in team fights. That's kind of really what his MO has been, but he was not fine in lane in this game. He was really not good. And Marcoon, you know, somebody who I've praised a lot on this channel, somebody who I've talked very highly of, somebody who I have a lot of confidence in, just got out jungled in the early game playing Lee Sin by somebody who's never played in the LEC. That's a bit concerning. And then done of the game for me just has to go to Shigenda. He counterpicks himself on the top side by blind picking Aatrox into a Gwen meta, gets Gwen, you know, counterpicked, and now he's sitting here with Aatrox. He can't really do anything, but outside of that, he also played really bad. He got run over in the laning phase. He had absolutely no pressure on the map. This was a bad game from Shigenda. I saw a lot of people in my comment section of my LEC video talking about how, you know, Shigenda wasn't exactly, you know, as good as maybe I was giving him credit for. Maybe I was hyping him up a bit too much. And while I do think he was better last year than people give him credit for, I can definitely see some of the flaws, and honestly, I can see some of the concerns. Topside was the part of the map that I felt good about for Rogue going into this split. The reason I ranked them 6th was because I felt so good about the top side of the map, but it was Comp and Zoelise, by the way. It's Zoelise. I called him Zoelis in my primer video. I have corrected that now. It's Comp and Zoelise that were actually a lot better in this game and a lot more consistent. They weren't great. I mean, Comp's positioning was fine towards the back half of the game, but Larson got run over. Marcoon had no pressure on a champion that absolutely needs it, and Shigenda deserved dud of the game in this one. This was not a good showing from Rogue, and it's definitely going to be taken into account. It's going to be big for them to bounce back the rest of this week, because confidence-wise, I'm really not there with Rogue at the current moment after this game number 1, but I definitely am with SK Gaming. This was an awesome start to the split, an awesome start to the year for them, and if they can keep this kind of momentum up, especially in the early game, they could be a team that genuinely makes a lot more noise than even I was giving them credit for at the beginning of the split. Now moving on to game number 3, and this was the game of the day for a lot of different people. It's the debut of a hotly anticipated team here in the LEC. It was Fnatic taking on Corp. and Fnatic is going to be able to pick up the win. Fnatic is going to start 1-0, K-Corp is going to start 0-1, and honestly, this is kind of how I expected this game to go. It was relatively close in the early game, a lot of proactive plays coming out from KC, but they, and this will be a theme as we talk about throughout the week with them, they just don't know how to close out games at this level. Their mid games are really bad, if I'm being entirely honest, and this was not a very good mid game from them. I think they really didn't have a lot of ways to be able to keep Fnatic in check. They lost some fights that really ended up mattering, and then obviously K'Sante ended up just rolling out of control on the top side of the map for Fnatic. It feels like top lane is in a very strong state right now, which I could have told you obviously before the split, because I mentioned it 100 times. Every other analyst mentioned it 100 times. This isn't supposed to be a pat on the back, just like this isn't a surprise to see top lane be so influential on the game, but top lane continues to be very, very valuable, and even with a couple of mistakes from Fnatic here and there throughout the game sprinkled in, they were still the better team by a pretty large margin, and they were able to walk away with a pretty confident win. Player of the game for me is going to go to Oscarinin on the top side. Like I said, it really does feel like top lane is incredibly valuable and incredibly influential in the game at the current moment. Whether it's Gwen, whether it's K'Sante, there are going to be other picks that we talk about. The Jax is going to come up as a top lane pick. It was picked in this game as a jungle pick, which is certainly intriguing. I like the flex option that they offered here for Casey. I actually, like the draft a bit with a couple of exceptions, but, Fnatic ended up just being a little bit more valuable in the mid to late game, and that K'Sante just ended up just dominating. I mean, when you can build 3 support items on when you can build Locket plus Redemption on K'Sante and still be the tankiest person in the game, something's gone wrong, and the new items need to be tweaked up just a tad bit. But Oscar was really, really good in this game. I think he individually played very, very well. I thought Cabo did a really good job in the early game to stop any sort of pressure that was being put on the top side of the map to kind of neutralize what Oscar wanted to do, but by the time mid-game hit, once you were getting into the team fights, it was just basically a feeding ground for this K'Sante to get super fed, to be able to start running over the game, and I think Oscar did a great job. If he's gonna really take that next step, that next leap up, like I think everybody kind of wants him to do in 2024, these are the performances that he needs to have. I'm definitely 1 foot in, 1 foot out on Oscarinin. I liked a lot of the games that we saw from him last year, but I'm certainly not sold on him as this potential future superstar in the top lane. This is the kind of performance that would start to change my mind, and so the more of this we get, the more I'm gonna feel good about it. Razork, I think, also played really well this game. He was really a player that, drew a lot of contention, I think, from the comment section. I think there were a lot of people that said that I had a couple of the junglers misranked, whether Yike was too high, whether, El Yoyo was ranked too high. Those players I think we will talk about. I was pretty spot on with them, but Razork coming in as my 4th best jungler was not supposed to be some sort of diss to him. I thought he was a really good player, and he was right in that contention with a lot of the other best junglers, like the top 3 in the league, in my opinion, and this was the kind of performance that did put him there. Now, he's got to be able to sustain it. The problem with Razork has never been his good performances, it's been his bad performances, and if he's going to be able to have these games over and over again, if the consistency is going to be a lot more there this year than it has at any other point throughout his career up until this point, that's going to change my mind about Razork. Again, we know the talent is there, we know the ability to take over games in the early game is there, but especially if his laners are winning heavily, that's always been something Razork has been really kind of reliant on. He's very much an early game, tempo-oriented jungler, and if his laners are winning, that's going to help him out a lot, and so this was a really good example of how the top side can do well. The bot side of the map was a little bit more inconsistent for Fnatic, even despite some of the score lines. Humanoid and Noah both in this game had their moments where they weren't perfect. I think Noah struggled quite a bit in the early game. That's to be expected. It's Aphelios Milio into Lucian Nami. A lot of pressure put on by K-Corp into the bot lane, and Noah just wasn't, positioning in the right place to be able to hold up to that pressure. He lost a lot more resources than I think he actually had to in the early game, and I don't think June helped out a ton, but, by the time you hit the late game, the Milio could just drop the thing, and all of a sudden the game becomes a lot easier for Aphelios. And then while Humanoid was playing really well in the early game, dominating Seiken in the laning phase, he made a pretty critical mistake in the mid game, just kind of trying to dive a Jax under tower and just dying for no reason. That's pretty traditional Humanoid. I have, in the past gotten pushback on saying that Humanoid is a bit overrated as a player, but those comments have honestly kind of stopped. I think people are starting to learn that while Humanoid is great, he's just going to have moments throughout the year, and there are going to be games throughout the year where he's just not very good. He was good for the most part in this game. He definitely outplayed Seiken, but he's not this top 1 mid laner in the LEC like I think a lot of people really want him to be. He's just a really good player, and, he's going to be a top 1 mid laner in the playoffs, and maybe not so much in the regular season, but topside winning as hard as they did was really, really big for Fnatic, and it really kind of let them cruise to a victory, especially down the stretch once they started winning fights. And then for K-Corp, Again, not going to harp on them too much. They did a couple of interesting things this game. They wanted to play towards the Lucian Nami in the early game, specifically towards Upset, trying to get him ahead and trying to capitalize on the early game advantage that they have, because I think they felt pretty confident in the scaling that Jax Azir offered, especially with the Gragas going full AP in the top lane. And, you know, if you are able to get that bot lane rolling, all of a sudden this game becomes a lot easier. The problem became that they ended up trading a lot of gold and a lot of kills in order to make that happen. And by the time you hit the mid game, they were actually not in a good position to win a lot of these fights, because Cassante started getting online. The Akali was dealing damage. You know, the Aphelios really wasn't all that behind. You know, he was behind, but he wasn't all that behind. And Razork was doing a really good job at controlling the map, especially over Bo, who had some miserable macro this game, and that's why Bo is going to get my death of the game. It's not just the 7 deaths. I mean, that's a pretty standard thing for Bo. If you watched Vitality last year, 7 deaths is honestly low for him in terms of a loss, but it was the macro, which was just really, really bad this game coming out from Bo. And, you know, I said it in my primer video, if one player, you know, was going to hold this team back, in my opinion, this year, I would expect it to be Bo. Now, he had good moments in this game as well. I thought his early game was generally fine. He had a game plan, he had a strategy, but once this game started spiraling out of control, we saw the Bo that we saw on Vitality last year, which was the one that was actively losing games for his team. If this is the version of Bo that you're going to get, K-Corp is just not going to be competitive in year number 1. It is as simple as that. I think there were other players on this team that didn't play well. I think really the only player on this team that I can excuse in terms of, you know, gameplay was probably Upset in the bot lane, who I think played relatively fine. He just didn't have any sort of impact on Lucian. Everybody else, I think, kind of got outplayed by their opposition. I think Cabochard, specifically in the back half of the game, was a complete non-factor. He went full AP Gragas and he was dealing 0 damage while Oscarinen was 1v5ing fights. Seiken got run over in the laning phase. His scoreline looks okay because his team fighting was honestly probably the best of anybody on the team, but I mean, really, the laning phase was so miserable from him that it kind of cancels itself out, and Targamas was not good at all. He very narrowly got my dud of the game on the Nami here. Targamas did not play well. The mechanics were just not there. Stepping too far forward, he did not look comfortable on this champion, even a little bit. K-Corp has good things going for them. They had a game plan. They had a style in the early game that they wanted to play, but their macro simply has to be better. Their mid to late game simply has to be better if they're going to take down some of the best teams in the league, like I think their expectation is. Fnatic just looked a little bit too much for them in game number 1. But again, it's just game 1. Their schedule does get a bit easier after, you know, game number 2 here. Basically, their hard schedule is front-loaded, which is good for them, but you know, hopefully they can go on a bit of a run after this. But for Fnatic, this is a really good start to the split. Oscar and Razork in particular looked awesome. If they can keep that up, they're going to be a genuinely competitive team once again this year, as they always are. And then moving on to game 4 here of day 1, it's the debut of another rookie here in the mid lane for one of these teams. It's GIANTX taking on Team Vitality, and yet again, it's another good debut as GIANTX is going to be able to pick up their first win as a branded unit, as GIANTX is the merger here between Giants and Excel, and Vitality once again is going to collapse in the late game. And, you know, this game was certainly something. I don't necessarily feel like I feel better about either of these teams after this game. I certainly don't feel better about Vitality, but I'm really not sure I feel better about GIANTX either. Like, Giants just weren't very good in this game for most of it. I think they ended up out team fighting in the late game, but this really was a battle of who was going to throw harder, and unfortunately for Vitality, they're always going to win that battle. If that's a competition, they are 100% going to be able to win that. So, you know, congrats to Giants for picking up the win, but they did do some things really well in the back half of this game. I do want to give them a bit of credit. Mostly the carry duo here of Jackies and Patrick, who I think both played really well in this one. Jackies is going to get my player of the game. Those Nico ultimates were incredibly clutch, incredibly important. I know the scoreline doesn't necessarily reflect just how important he was to this game, but without the setups that he was having, without the consistent 2, 3, 4-man Nico ultimates in pivotal fights, GX is just not winning this game. So credit to Jackies. You know, this was a player that I really did not believe in going into the split. I had him ranked as the lowest rated player in the LEC to start the year, at least without seeing anything. But, you know, as I said in my primer video, the more I delved into his tape in the Czech League, the more I was like, okay, there actually is something here. Clearly, they found a player that is, you know, interesting to build around, but is it going to be able to work immediately? Well, it certainly did in game number 1. He did still have his flaws. His laning phase was really not good. If you're going to play Nico into Azir, you simply have to win early. That's kind of the thing with Nico, is you want to be able to win lane, and he didn't do that. He didn't do that effectively really at all, and you know, that can be a bit concerning, but being able to play fights a little bit more aggressively in the back half, if you can make up for it when it matters the most, that I'm going to overlook some of the more negative traits. He still has a long way to go in order to become a more consistent mid laner at this level, but this was a really good start. And then there's Patrick, who I just think is a really good player. If you can get the ball rolling on Draven, it becomes so much easier. There were times where I thought GX was going to lose this game after basically feeding Patrick in the early game, but it wasn't his fault. I mean, he was able to do a lot of damage, and his positioning, I think, was relatively fine. It certainly was better than the AD carry opposing him in this game, but, you know, that Draven was really influential in the back half. Some of those hooks were good, and some of them were a little bad as well, but for the most part, I think the bot lane actually was the other big bright spot for GX in this game. Patrick being able to get that lead early, even if it was kind of donated to him by his team, and then Ignar really putting the pedal to the metal and continuing to look like a playmaker. This was a really good game number 1 from Ignar. He definitely outplayed Hylissang on the other side of this map, basically playing the Hylissang style of just moving around, trying to find advantages, picking a lane to dominate over and over again, and just trying to feed the member of the team that he knows is the win condition. This is the Ignar that we saw at the end of the year for energy, and it's really good to see that carry over here into the LEC. This is why they picked him up, was to get good performances like this. Jackie's and Ignar both playing really well, and Patrick, I think, doing a good job in that same vein. Odo was fine this game. This was kind of, you know, the opposite of what we've seen from a lot of the other games up until this point. Top lane really wasn't all that influential. Peach certainly made some mistakes. I think his macro was not very good in this one. That was my concern with him going into the year. The reason I ranked him so low in my jungle rankings, I really am not a gigantic fan of Peach up until this point, and I don't think he did anything this game to really change my mind, but at the end of the day, Vitality really wanted to lose this game, and so the advantages that GX was able to get with some of their good players ended up outweighing any of the negatives that the rest of the team was going to give them. And then for Vitality, this is just not good, man. I mean, your macro is miserably bad. You have no recognition of, like, where the enemy team wants to be at any given time. I don't want to call it, like, a sixth sense, but at a pro level, you need to have an understanding of what the other team is going to want to do when you see their draft. And obviously, when you look at this draft for GX, you are going to see that they're going to dive bot. You're going to see that they're going to play towards this Draven. You have a Blitzcrank. You have a Xin Zhao. You even have a Nico if you want to bring her down. You have so many tools to be able to try to get this Draven ahead. To not spend a lot of resources trying to make sure that your bot lane is in a spot to be protected after drafting Kalista, it's just bad. It's really bad game plan, and it's really bad decision making. I'm not going to sit here and say that that's something that is going to concern me for the entirety of the year, because generally I like this coaching staff, but this was a bad game number 1 from them from a game plan perspective. They tried to get back in the back half of this game. Photon, I think, had a couple of really good fights on this Jackson. You know, there were a couple of engages from Douglas and from VTO that were fine, but bot lane in general, this game was just really bad. Karzi is going to get my dud of the game on the Kalista. His positioning, especially in the back half of this game, was just not good. I understand that you need to play a little bit more aggro to get the most out of Kalista, especially when you're going into something like Draven, but you can't just walk up to get, you know, Blitzcrank hooked. Like, that's not good. You need to be able to protect yourself in some way, shape, or form. I very narrowly gave this to Hylissang because outside of the ultimates coming in on the Renata, he didn't do anything this game. I mean, some of the bailouts were fine, and, you know, they ended up, you know, keeping some people alive, but, like, Renata just didn't actually affect the game really all that much, and especially in the early laning phase, Renata was more of a hindrance than she was a positive. I don't think this was a very good look from a bot lane that was growing over the course of last year. I think this is a really bad start, and if this is going to be the version of this bot lane that you get, that's concerning, because we know they can be feast or famine players. But again, you know, this is just game 1. I'm not going to overreact. I'm not going to freak out too much. I did, again, like what Photon was doing this game. Douglas wasn't nearly as outmatched as I think he, you know, was going to be in my mind. Going into this split, he was fine in this game, mostly because Peach wasn't really putting his foot on the gas, but the Rel at least had some engages, and VTO I don't think made any sort of major errors. He also wasn't pushing the team forward, though. This is kind of the version of VTO we got last year on Heretics towards the end of the year, maybe even the Excel version, and that concerns me, and that was the team I compared Vitality to last, you know, in the primer anyways, was Excel. I was like, this team has a lot of talent, but I could see a world in which it's a bunch of good players that don't turn into a great winning team, and at least in game 1, it is a concerning amount correct, right? This was a very similar game to what Excel showed in Winter Split of last year, and it's funny that GX is the team to end up capitalizing and taking advantage of that, but this is a nice win for GX. Not going to completely change my opinion and my thought process on this team, because I still am a bit concerned, but they at the very least passed the first test, and that's what you got to do if you want to climb up in the power rankings. And that's going to bring us to our final game of the first day here, and this was a bit of an upset, but what a fun one. What a fun upset to be given, a dominating one here between Mad Lions and Team Heretics. And Mad Lions just absolutely obliterates them. I mean, truly, this was not a close game. At any point, Mad Lions started running away with this basically from 5 minutes onwards. And this is what you want to see. When you talk about a team that everybody, me included, had ranked 10th in their pre-split power rankings, for them to come out against, what is essentially a super team. It's not exactly a super team in the same way that we've had, super teams in other regions in the past, or like even super teams this year, but it's a lot of veteran players. It's a lot of players who wanted to play together, who have had success playing together in the past, a lot of established names. For them to get absolutely shellacked in game number 1 by a team full of rookies, it's really fun. It's a really, really good sign. And honestly, for all the people in the comments section of both my grades video and my primer video that were saying that Elyoya was overrated, that he didn't deserve the number 1 spot, here you go, man. I don't know what else you want to see, but this was pretty darn good. Pretty darn good start to the split. He's going to get my player of the game in game number 1. It just simply couldn't go to anybody else. Like, I like the way everybody else played, specifically Alvaro in the support position, who I thought was really good this game. Even Frescoe, I thought had a really good game, but this was Elyoya's game. This was about Xin Zhao. This was him moving around the map. This was him controlling everything. This was him consistently making plays over and over again and essentially making the game over by 10 minutes. This was a masterclass of a performance, and this just goes to show that, truly he might be the best player in the LEC. It really is a conversation that people need to have. I think he's right up there. You could make the argument with anybody that, I would take Elyoya. It's him, it's Mickey X. Like, those are probably the two that I would consider to be the best players in the LEC, and this is the kind of game that really reinforces that opinion for me. Just awesome stuff. I really hope he's going to be able to keep this up. I'm not trying to downplay anything that the Movistar players or any of the rookies ended up doing in this game, because, like I said, I think Alvaro and Frescoe in particular played really well, but Elyoya is the rock of this team. For him to be able to come out and just dominate macro-wise against a very veteran, very experienced team, clearly just have a better meta read, clearly have a better read on how they want to get advantages in the early game. For him to come out and do that, it's incredibly impressive, and, I really hope he's going to be able to keep that up. But like I said, really big credit to a lot of the rookies here. Alvaro was awesome on the Renata. Sometimes this champion can feel a little passive in terms of the early game, in terms of what she's actually able to offer, but man, when you get a player that just comes out and is like, nope, we want to win. We want to win fast. We're going to play with our jungle, and we're going to play really aggro to try to pick up kills, not just get lane tempo. Renata can really look like a dominant pick, and this was an awesome game from Alvaro. I really hope to see him continue to play like this. It was no secret that I was a big fan of Supa and Alvaro coming into the year, as I think a lot of analysts were. I'm certainly not unique in that respect, but Alvaro looked amazing in this game number 1. Frescoe looked amazing on the LeBlanc in this game number 1. Completely outplayed Perks at every aspect of the game. Beat him in lane, roamed a lot more, played with his jungle better. This was a great performance from the player that I said was going to be maybe the weak link of the team in 2024. It's just everything you could want to see. Supa didn't have to do anything on the Aphelios, which is always a good sign. Merwin got to play Gwen and just win in the top lane, which is a good sign. This was a dominant win from Mad Lions, and basically everything you could have wanted to see out of basically most of these players' first ever games in the LEC. And then for Heretics, disaster. Disaster has struck in game number 1, but, and I know this is not what people want to hear, there is more reason to think that this is an outlier than that this is the norm, right? First of all, this is a miserable draft. This is just a really bad read on the meta. This is early picking Lucian Nami. This is giving over Gwen Xin Zhao for free. This is drafting Ryze at all, who's just not very good in the meta. This is just a really bad idea of, like, what you want to do. I think the draft is pretty poor. It's a really bad read on, like, what is strong at the current moment, and I think because of that, they had already set themselves at such a big disadvantage, and on top of that, it seems like they didn't have any sort of idea that it's really easy to gank bot lane now, that, obviously with the new map changes, bot lane has become basically a free gank if you want it early on in games, and they were just playing way too far up, weren't giving any sort of respect. Obviously, there were a lot of misplays this game, but once you get to the point in, like, 8 minutes into the game, and you're down like 4 or 5k gold, like, there's no coming back. There's really no plays that they can make that would make me more interested. This is one of those games where, honestly, I'm less concerned about Heretics losing by, 16 kills in 27 minutes than I am about, Vitality throwing, a lead that they had, or Corp struggling in the mid game, or Rogue just looking generally bad throughout a majority of their day 1. Like, I think these are the kinds of games that you just chalk up and say, well, we lost. Like, we got outplayed in the early game, we had a bad meta read, and we lost. And, obviously we can talk about some of these players underperforming. Perks had a miserable game on the Rise. Easy choice for dud of the game here. Not a good day to be a Perks defender like I am, but again, he has these games. Even last year, he had these games in Summer Split a lot, and, the trajectory hasn't exactly been the best for him, but even when he was playing great in 2022 for Vitality, he would have these games. When he was playing great in Winter Split of last year, he would have these games. It's not unlike Perks to just get run over sometimes and to have games where he just booms, and this is, one of those games. It's all about whether or not that's going to become the norm or whether even that's going to become, half the time. If that's going to become half of the performances that Perks offers, then that's going to be a concern. But, if it's just one game, I'm not going to freak out. Kaiser continued to be pretty poor in this game. Nami, in general, looked really bad on day number 1, and we'll talk about that. He looked, Delusion Nami did not look good in week 1 in general, but Kaiser, I think, played it really poorly. Alvaro just outclassed him in every single aspect on the Enchanters in this first game. Jankos just started inting by the end of this game on the Vi. He was not very good. Wunder didn't do anything. Flakked couldn't really survive at all on the Lucian. Heretics just got outclassed. There's only so much you can talk about in a 17-1 stomp coming in from one team, but, it's really good from Mad Lions. I think that's more of the positive that I want to take away from this. More of the narrative that I think should be taken away from this is Mad playing well rather than Heretics playing bad, because, we'll see, later on this week, but, sometimes you just get blown out. The best teams in the world sometimes just get blown out after a bad early game. It happens. It's all going to be about how you respond, but for Mad to be able to generate that strong early game, to be able to play around your win conditions, to have a really good read on the meta like it seems they have, it's really encouraging, and I think this could be a team that does a lot better than even I predicted them at the beginning of the year. And now we can move on here to day number 2, and kicking off the middle of the week here in week number 1, it was GIANTX taking on Team BDS, and BDS getting their win back. Both of these teams moving to 1-1 after BDS is able to pick up the pretty clean win here. I would definitely say that they were the better team, although, we're certainly starting to find some meta trends, I think, with some champions that may be able to extend games out a little bit longer than maybe some other champions, keep teams alive even in circumstances where it might not be as favorable for them. We'll talk about Nico in a second, but for BDS, this was a lot more like the team that I think I was expecting to see. This wasn't a dominant performance, but it was a good one, and I think that's really where I expected BDS to land. It's why I had them at number 5 in my power rankings at the beginning of the split, was because really what I thought this team was going to be was a good version of what they were last year, but with some inconsistencies, because I do think that there is potential for the league as a whole to be better than it was last year, which is why they moved down to number 5 in my power rankings, especially considering the new AD carry. But, this was a solid performance. I mean, it was a BDS draft, a lot more through and through than maybe what they had in game number 1. You have Adam on the Garen, you have Nuke on the Orianna, which I think is better. Even Ice, I think, played really well this game on the Varus, but player of the game was pretty obviously going to go to Adam in the top lane. He was just so influential and instrumental towards the back half of this game on that Garen in particular. It's really easy to sit here and be like, oh, you got to pick meta, you got to pick Gwen, you got to pick Aatrox, you got to pick Cassante, or else you're not going to be a good top laner. But when you see Garen just running at a Kalista, auto-attacking her twice, pressing Q and then pressing ult and just killing her in a fight, the fed Kalista on the other side of the map, you're like, okay, no, actually, maybe Garen's really good, and maybe if you can't really stop that, if you can't really do anything about it, then he should just keep picking it. And that's really where I'm at right now. Obviously, it's still important to ban out things like Darius and Olaf against him, and so, it creates this dynamic where you're either investing all of your bans into Adam, or you're, leaving something that he can play up. And I think leaving the Garen up was a fine choice. It just didn't end up working out. Odoamne didn't really do anything this game, and Adam was really just allowed to run free towards the back half. This was a much better game number 2 than it was a game number 1 from him. I think the rest of this team played well in that same vein, though. Ice in particular, I thought, actually had a very good game. I've been pretty low on Ice coming into the split. I don't think any of the imports in the LEC this year really excited me a ton. It didn't feel like they were bringing in any, top-tier talent or really even any interesting, Challengers League prospects. It felt like a lot of the imports that were new to the league this year were veterans that were, struggling at a higher level and then came down to a lower level to try to do something, and I wasn't sure how that was going to translate in the preseason to potentially, trying to win in the LEC. But Ice was actually really good in this game, and this was really his first big test. Patrick was also really good on the other side of the map. Of course, getting chased down by Garen isn't exactly his fault, but, I think the Varus is one of those champions that people are pretty low on. I think generally speaking, especially Lethality Varus, there isn't a lot of hype around him, in pro at the current moment, at least by the fan base, but this is what it looks like when that pick goes right. It's Ice showing up and really dealing a lot of damage super consistently from such a long range and not really being able to be answered in any easy capacity. Ashe helps with that. Orianna helps with that. Nuke had a very critical ultimate shockwave towards the back half of the game, which was super important because he was miserably bad before that. In this game, he just had no impact. Sheo was a lot better on the Graves, although, once again, he really actually didn't have that big of an impact on the game. This was mostly Adam and Ice, in my opinion, in that big ultimate from Nuke in the back half of the game to win it for BDS. And then for GX on the other side, you know, back to earth a bit here. I think you're not playing Vitality. You're playing a team that is going to be a bit more comfortable taking advantage of some of the mistakes that this team is making, and they did make quite a few mistakes. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Peach. I mean, he got out-jungled this game. It really wasn't particularly close. That Lee Sin is just not working for him at the current moment. You need to be aggressive early, especially into something like Graves, because he's just going to insta-outscale you, and Sheo just played super safe, super passive, and Peach was not able to generate those leads. Peach was not able to be aggressive enough to actually be relevant in this game, and you know, this is the Peach that I kind of said we were going to get in 2024. This is the Peach that I think the tape last year ended up showing is a player that's good. He's not necessarily somebody who makes a ridiculous amount of mistakes. He's not going to lose your team games actively, like, on his own, but he really isn't proactive enough to be able to be this outstanding jungler that I think this team thinks that he is. Obviously, he helped out Excel a lot last year when he joined the roster, but it's not been a very good first 2 games from him. He was the weak link on his team in game number 1, and he was the weak link on his team in game number 2 here as well, so that's something to keep in mind. Jungle could be a position of worry for GX. Otoamne with the classic top lane 0-0-1, you know, experience and actively having no impact on the game. I almost wanted to give him dead of the game just because he didn't do anything, but he also didn't make any mistakes, and so it just is what it is. I think Jackie's was actually secretly kind of bad this game. Obviously, the Nico was influential because Nico as a champion just does a really good job of making it difficult for the enemy team to initiate and actually make any plays, but, you know, I don't really think Jackie's himself played well. He was taking a ward, not being transformed right before that big shockwave play that led to essentially them losing the game, and that was pretty bad. I do think Patrick and Ignar continue to look like the strength of this team down in the bot lane. What else is new? Patrick being the strength for an Excel team. It's not a huge shock here, but, you know, they have been continuously good. Patrick did a great job of being able to generate an early lead. The problem is just that he didn't have anybody else on his team that was actually strong enough to be able to peel for him and allow him to win some of the fights in the mid game. It ended up just spiraling out of control. Garen was too strong to, he could instantly stop the Fed Callista, and then you have a Varus from 8,000 screens away also just pelting you with lethality strikes, and so very different, you know, game, I think, to what they had in game number 1, but this is the version of GX that I think I'm more comfortable saying is probably real. A good team, you know, one that can beat teams that are struggling, but they are going to make mistakes, and they are going to be, you know, mistakes that can be capitalized on by teams that are better than them, and BDS certainly is better than them. This is a much better performance. Still not perfect, still looking for more consistency, especially out of that mid lane role, but for now, it looks like they're going to be at least a solid middle of the pack team at absolute worst. And moving on to a pretty big rivalry game now in game number 2. It is obviously a pretty personal affair between 2 players on each of these teams. It's Mad Lions Koi taking on SK Gaming. And SK Gaming is able to pick up their 2nd win of the season. They're the first team to go to 2-0 in the regular season here in the LEC. And Niski officially takes down Elyoya in their regular season matchup. Their first, obviously, since Niski ended up leaving Mad Lions this offseason. Very, very big win here for SK. Mad obviously looked really good on day number 1. They looked significantly less good here on day number 2. It felt like they were going for a lot of aggressive plays, which is kind of what we praised them for in day number 1, but SK is just kind of a bit better at the aggression thing, it would seem, moving into the second half of this weekend. That's a really, really good thing to say. SK feels very legit. Now, Mad is certainly not the most established, like, guaranteed best team in the world or anything like that, but this is still a nice win for SK, and moving to 2-0 so early on is really big. Last year, it took about 3 to 4 wins to guarantee your spot in the group stage of the second, the second stage here in the LEC, and so SK basically already being halfway there after their first 2 games is pretty darn good, but this team looks awesome. They are firing on all cylinders. They're very aggro in the early game, and they really do not take their foot off the gas. This was a fun game with a lot of really fun players. Player of the game for me, though, is once again going to go to Isma in the jungle. This was a bit of a jungle gap game, and saying that into Elyoya is certainly a bit of a surprise. This dude dominated the first game of the season into Heretics and into GIANTX, which is certainly not an easy feat for him to come back out, maybe play a little bit bit over aggressive, maybe play a little bit over eager because he is playing in a, in a personal matchup, but to get out jungled so thoroughly in this game and so early on, it's really impressive, and Isma deserves all of the credit for that. Yes, you can give a lot of it to Niski because he did play well on the Akali in this game. I think Broadcast ended up giving him player of the game, or fan vote ended up giving him player of the game, but I think that's more of a narrative. Isma was the best player in this game, and he was the one who was really pushing SK forward. It seems that not only can he be a really effective carry, which is something that we already knew he could be in the jungle position from his time in the ERLs, but he's gonna be a really elite playmaker for the rest of this team in the same vein. This Rel game was truly outstanding, and if he continues to play like this, I mean, Rookie of the Year is like the least of his expectations if he continues to play as well as he has through the first 2 games of the split. Exakik and DOS continue to look really good. Supa and Alvaro were obviously awesome on day number 1, but Exakik and DOS were just significantly better here on day 2. They were able to win this kind of volatile early game matchup between Kalista and Lucian, and they never really looked back. Renata continues to look like the most efficient support in the LEC at the current moment. I think a lot of people want to see more engagers. That's kind of been a hot topic up until this point, but I expected Enchanters to be really strong at the start of this split, and they have been, and Renata definitely feels like the strongest, at least in the LEC. It pairs really well with Kalista, who has been very successful in the LEC so far, and so really nice to see the bot lane that I was really excited to see take that second step in year number 2 continue to look really good in this second game. Like I said, Niski was good. Irrelevant continued to look really good on the top side, this time on Renekton. It was all 5 members of SK. This team just continues to look awesome. Everybody is winning. They have a very clear idea of how they want to play the game, and they know how to execute on it. It's just really good stuff from a team that is maybe not a middle-of-the-pack team at this point. And then for Mad, it's not a great second game here after schlacking Heretics in game number 1. They get destroyed themselves by SK. This wasn't a particularly close game. There weren't really a ton of moments. Supa tried to get some gold to kind of come back here. Supa and Alvaro were actually pretty okay in this game. Merwin was okay in this game. He did an alright job of trying to stay relevant against irrelevant for a lot of this game, but mid-jungle just completely collapsed for Mad. Elyoya was really bad this game. Pretty easy choice for dud of the game. Didn't really have to think about this one all that much. When you play Xin Zhao, when it doesn't work, it looks really bad. I know we've seen Xin Zhao just generally be really successful across this split up until this point, but, he still is a very volatile, very risky pick. He's very feast or famine. If you hit that mid to late game and you're really far behind, that champion is going to do absolutely nothing. And that's kind of what we saw here. He went for a lot of early game plays, Elyoya did, and they didn't work out. Isma was a lot more active in the early game and ended up getting a lot more out of those plays than Elyoya did, and because of that, he ended up being a lot stronger, and the Xin Zhao really didn't have any ways of getting in to dive on any of the members of SK. It's really just Kalista, and there's so much peel on the side of SK, and then Frescoe, I think, also played pretty poorly on the Gragas. He picked the Gragas mid into Niski. That's a pretty bold call, in my opinion, but, Niski ended up punishing him quite a bit for it. Frescoe looked pretty outclassed in this one. This was more of what I expected to see at the beginning of the year for Frescoe. I thought it would take some time for him to get adjusted to laning against some of the LEC's best mid laners, and, we kind of saw that here. This was a lot more of, I don't want to say what I expected, but again, picking Gragas into Niski and losing, it's just kind of what you would think would happen in a circumstance like this. For Mad, in the bigger picture, I still think they're fine. We'll have to see what they do on the third day. They've had 2 pretty polarizing outcomes, and obviously I think what Heretics does on the other 2 days are going to matter a lot. If Heretics turns out to be awful and, they completely shit the bed, then obviously that win looks less good, but, if they kind of bounce back, then we can look at that as an early game that just kind of got out of control for them, and, Mad's going to need that win on day 3 in order to kind of solidify themselves a bit more. But for SK, I feel really, really excited about what, this team could be. Obviously, they were my breakout pick in the primer, which looks pretty good so far, but it's just the first 2 games, and it's not like they've played the toughest of competition. Rogue and Mad aren't exactly the 2 best teams in the league, and so, it's going to be a real test in day number 3. They have a genuinely tough game against Fnatic that, obviously, I'm very excited to see, but at least through the first 2 days, they passed just about every test you could possibly throw at them. And then moving on to game number 3 here, and once again, it looks like it's the game of the day coming in the 3rd slot. We'll see if that continues to be a trend as the year goes on, but it's G2 Esports taking on Corp. And G2 is going to pick up their second win of the year. They're going to start 2-0, and Corp is unfortunately going to start their LEC tenure off with an 0-2 start. And it's not really what I think they were looking for. I think that obviously their fans were very passionate and, they brought a lot of energy, not only to the arena, which was great. Honestly, watching these games was more fun than watching games, domestically, basically anywhere in a long time. The atmosphere was phenomenal. I hope this keeps up, but they also brought a bit of toxicity online, and it's definitely interesting to see Corp start off slow, but it's a tough start, man. I mean, Fnatic and G2, not an easy introduction to the league. I mean, they're getting their hardest games out of the way first. That is absolutely for sure. But for G2, they continue to look solid. This was kind of just a good game from them, which is very reminiscent of what I said on day one, where it was like, they lost early and they figured it out and they were able to come back and win. Day number 2, it was a lot more even, I think, throughout a lot of the game, but G2 really had control over the entirety of the game. It was kind of a 4v5 in favor of G2. We'll talk about Cabo in a bit. He didn't really do anything, but G2, I think, did everything they needed to do well, and I think that there were a lot of positives to take away from this game, even if there was, a couple of things where, maybe Hans Sama was giving over a bunch of gold to Corp for no reason, that French bias coming in from Hans trying to give them their first win. But let's talk about it. Player of the game, maybe surprisingly, is going to go to Caps for me instead of Yike. I think a lot of people are going to give it to Yike because of the 7-kill Viego, but a lot of those fights were just Viego resets, and, a lot of it was kind of set up for him. I thought Yike played well. I certainly don't think he played poorly, but I don't think he was player of the game for me. I think it's going to go to the AD LeBlanc in the mid lane, who just was exerting so much pressure. It's such a difficult lane to end up dealing with. Poor Saken has to deal with Humanoid and then Caps in his first 2 games as an LEC mid laner. It's, it's a tough pull, but, Caps' dominated laning phase was able to exert a lot of pressure and was just uncatchable throughout the back half of the game. He was such a nuisance. He was dealing a ridiculous amount of damage. He was taking turrets in side lanes. He was, popping in and out and poking for infinite amounts of damage because he could never be caught, and then Yike could just come in and clean up every single kill. I mean, it was really unplayable for KC once Caps was playing as well as he was. And again, I know Caps isn't necessarily the player that everybody remembers him being from 2019, 2020, 2021, that era of Caps, but, he started off this season really hot, in my opinion. Both of the first 2 games, I think, have been really, really good from him, and I think it's really only reinforced that I believe that he is the best mid laner still in Europe, and I think he had another game to prove that here. Yike, like I said, was good, but didn't necessarily, live up to the 7-2-4 scoreline, was very active on the map and definitely out-jungled Bo in terms of the pressure that he was able to apply. Bo had a much better game here in Game 2 than he did in Game 1, but I still think Yike was the better jungler, and I think that just goes to show that, Yike, the confidence that I put in Yike at the beginning of the year was definitely well placed. I think a lot of the talk of him being overhyped, I think, was probably, just reactionary. I think people want G2 to be overhyped. I don't think they are. I think Yike is who we think he is, and he had another good game here. If there is a concern for G2, it's that Hans Sama continues to not look perfect here. He played on the Aphelios, and man, his positioning was awful. Upset outplayed him throughout the entirety of this game. Upset was by far the better bot laner, and honestly, Targamas was pretty good on the Milio in that same vein. Bot lane was definitely the strength for KC in this game, and Hans tried his best to throw it, but at the end of the day, the top side of the map just wasn't going to allow that to happen. Broken Blade was actually involved in fights. Yike and Caps as a jungle mid were carrying the game, and that was enough for G2 to be able to win. But if Hans continues to struggle a bit, it's definitely going to raise some red flags. He is already the only player on this team that I did not have as an A, minus or above graded player in terms of value in my grades video, and honestly, that's looking pretty true. I'm not going to say he's the weak link of this team, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. I'm not sure if he is the same elite AD carry that he was last year. It's only been 2 games. It's very, very small sample size, but, his problems, I think, are very apparent, and they continue to be taken advantage of. But Yike and Caps were awesome. It's hard to talk about a bunch of G2 weaknesses when they were able to win the game as cleanly as they did. And then for KC on the other side, again, it's a rough loss. You're playing G2 in your second game. You're not really expected to win this. It's not really like a lot of people were expecting them to come out and be able to take this. And I think they did, at times perform above expectation. Upset and Targamas, I think, played well. Upset in particular, I think, had a really good game here on the Lucian. We've been seeing that pick really not work out, but there was no Nami. They picked it with the Milio instead, and this looked significantly more effective. A lot of the, the power and the damage on that combo, the Lucian-Nami combo, was taken away in a couple of patches. I think a lot of people really like the synergy that those two, their kits synergize really well together, but I think Lucian just synergizes really well with any aggressive enchanter, Milio included, that just kind of allows him to be a really big damage threat in the early and specifically in the mid game, and I think Upset did a good job of capitalizing on those I guess, specific, power spikes. I think Seiken was a bit better here in game number 2. Still got outplayed pretty heavily by Caps, but he at least held his own in the laning phase, which is more than I can say for the first game that he played here in the LEC. Like I said, Bo was definitely better, but done of the game, pretty obviously, is going to go to Cabochard in the top lane. I don't know what the deal was here. First of all, I don't know why you pick Malphite into Kennen LeBlanc. Like, I don't really understand it. It doesn't really make a ton of sense to me, but, I understand that you're still going to get value because that ultimate is very good as hard engage, and that's really what you're lacking here besides the Vi ultimate. Nico could potentially get on the backline, but you combo, Vi ultimate with Nico ult with Malphite ultimate. That's a one-team fight if you're in a good spot. But you know what Cabo's not doing? Playing the game. Like, he's sitting top lane. He feels like my solo queue top laner where he's just sitting up top, farming and, hitting towers and, waiting for somebody else on the team to do something, and it's just not gonna, you're not gonna win with that. I mean, like, he wasn't even winning in lane against Broken Blade. Not that he should in this matchup, but it's just, it's frustrating. It felt like his brain was entirely off. He's definitely been the player in the LEC with the least amount of impact through the first 2 games, and I don't really see any other way of saying that. He had basically no impact outside of avoiding a gank in game number 1 against Fnatic. That Gragas did nothing at full AP, mind you. That full AP Gragas did nothing in game 1. And he did significantly less here in game number 2. Cabo has to be better. I felt pretty good about him going into the year, but honestly, he's not been good, like, at all through the first 2 games. He simply is going to have to be better. The rest of the team, like I said, was fine, but G2 is just a step above what they're going to be able to offer. I'm not going to rag on KC too much. Starting 0-2 against Fnatic and G2 is not a surprise, but I am going to need to see some mental turnarounds from this team. I'm going to need to see them step up sooner rather than later. The schedule does get easier from this point onwards because you face the 2 Titans, but you got to be able to show that you can change your playstyle and actually be the aggressor rather than, the team that's kind of been adapting and just kind of losing in the mid to late game. And then G2 on the other side, like, they're G2. I wish these games were more comfortable wins because it's G2 and I want to see them dominate, but this is just how they operate. They don't destroy teams. They never really have destroyed teams. They don't have these super short games. They look very shaky all year long, but they win games anyways, and then they continue to win as we get into the playoffs. It's just kind of been what G2 is. This isn't out of the ordinary for them. Caps actually looks phenomenal, and I think Yike looks great. And I think if Hans can step it up and kind of be a little bit more consistent in that ADC role, they're still going to be, without a doubt, the #1 team in the LEC. And then moving on to game 4 here on day 2. This is a battle between 2 teams that were definitely moving in opposite directions at the start of the day. It's Fnatic taking on Team Vitality, and those 2 teams will continue to move in opposite directions as Fnatic continues to look really good, way ahead of schedule in my opinion, and Vitality continues to look really bad, significantly behind schedule in my opinion. It feels like their meta read has been, historically awful. Like, they are continuing to pick things that I think are just not good, leaving up things that I think are not good, and Fnatic is like, okay, we'll just take all the stuff we wanted to play in the first place, and we'll just beat you with it. And the scariest part is the regular season non-performers on Fnatic are performing, and that's terrifying. That is a terrifying prospect. If you're getting really good versions of both Razork and Humanoid in the regular season, that is a terrifying thing to say in week 1 of the winter split, but that seems to be what we have on our plates at the moment. So let's talk about it. Player of the game for me, no-brainer. It's going to Humanoid in the mid lane. This was an amazing Azir performance, and, I've been very critical of Humanoid on this channel. I think he gets a lot of, love from the community, and rightfully so. At his best, he is right up there with anybody else in terms of mechanics in the LEC, but focus and effort have been an issue for him in the past, at least in games that I don't think he is considered to be as important, and it's something that I've knocked him for quite a bit on this channel, not only last year, but in 2022 and in 2021 as well. Even going back to his time on Mad Lions and on Splice, like, it's always been a bit of an issue for him to play up to his standards every single game, but that has not been a problem through the first 2 games of the season so far. I think this team feels very motivated. They feel very connected. I'm not going to sit here and say the coaching staff has done, wonders. The big, coaching staff change has completely changed how this team wants to play, but it feels very noticeable on the Rift right now that there is a culture change in Fnatic at the start of 2024, and it's helping them a ton. Humanoid has been the biggest recipient of that, but it's not just him. Razork has felt very focused and very aggressive, and a lot of the worries that you have with Razork as a player, mostly that, if he didn't win early, he wasn't exactly the same kind of effective player that he had been, when he does win early. Those have also not necessarily been as much of a problem. Yes, he's still winning early, but his mid-game decisions are just smart decisions. He's just playing the game really well and at a high level right now. Oscar looks good on 2 games of Cassante. Everybody on Fnatic is really kind of showing up and showing out, and I don't think you could ask for a better start to the season for what Fnatic had, lined up. Obviously, the K-Corp game was fun, but they had to go and do their thing in that game to be able to win it. They weren't just given the win. They had to go and win it in the mid to late game. And the Vitality game, while they were kind of given the win in this one, at least they had to work for it. And, at least the players that stepped up. I even think June has been playing well, although I think he has been the least noticeable member of this Fnatic team, which I think is a good thing. He was the player that I said, as long as you can hide him in the background, I think that everybody else is really good here. I think Razork Humanoid can obviously be great. I really like Noah as a player, and he had a really good game, was certainly the better bot laner in this game. I think in general, Fnatic just kind of ran over Vitality, and a lot of the hype and momentum that was kind of surrounding them, the reason I put them at number 3 in my power rankings instead of a bit lower, like my projections would have said they would have liked to see them, it was because I did believe in this talent in the long run, and it does seem that even in the short term, this is going to be a pretty good, split and season for Fnatic. But for Vitality, it's basically the exact opposite here. This is a disaster of a start to the season. Not only have you lost to Fnatic, which is okay, you can live with that, but you kind of got destroyed. You never really looked all that competitive, and it's players that you really needed to step up that are not playing well. And then you also got beat by GIANTX on day 1, who we've already learned on day 2 maybe isn't even that good of a team, and so not a good look for Vitality, certainly not the situation that you wanted to find yourself in. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Carzzy once again here in the bot lane. I don't know if they just really like Lucian Nami, if him and Hilly just really want to play this bot lane, or if they just don't have a very good read of the meta. I would argue that it's probably the latter because they had that problem in game number 1 as well, but it's just not a very good bot lane right now. It's 0-5 in the LEC, and it's just not really what you want to see. Pun, or I guess rhyme not intended, but, this was my concern with Carzzy. Everybody was, talking to me in my grades video earlier on in the offseason about how it was super disrespectful that I put Carzzy as a B-graded player, as somebody who was good but inconsistent, while, I had other AD carry, with how good he was at the end of the split, and I said, yeah, I get it, he had a good summer split, but, Carzzy always crashes back down to earth. It's kind of been the career trajectory for him, is that he'll have a couple of good weeks and then he'll have a couple of bad weeks, and it just kind of is what it is with Carzzy at this point, and this is one of the bad weeks, and it just kind of happens. He's not been very good. He was really bad in game number 1, got completely outplayed by Patrick, and the same thing happened here in game number 2 against Noah. Yes, they're 2 of the better AD carries in the LEC in my opinion, but Carzzy was better than both at the end of the summer split last year, and he has been significantly worse than both in both of the games that he has played, and so in my opinion, a pretty worthy dud of the game, but you could give this to Hylissang, who continues to not look impressive. The Nami's just not working. No LEC bot or support player is playing Nami at a high level. I honestly think Nami is a very bait champion at the current moment. I think she is very weak, and I would expect that to continue to be a problem. And then Douglas continues to look a little bit outmatched at the jungle position. This is also kind of what I was expecting. I ranked him as the last ranked jungler in the LEC for a reason. I did not think he was going to be able to keep up against some of the better junglers in the league. If you're looking outclassed against Peach, who I don't think is great, I mean, you're definitely going to look outmatched against Razork, and that's just kind of what it is. Photon had a worse game here. Oscar was definitely better on the Cassante. VTO was whatever on the Xerath. The scoreline's fine. He didn't die, but he also had 0 impact on the game. This really is the, Heretics VTO just without any sort of carries around him, where he's playing AP Kaisa and these long-range artillery mages and Ziggs and things like that, and just not really winning games for his team, just being effective if the rest of the team is doing something good around him. This is not looking good for Vitality. I'm not going to hit full panic mode, but, if they start the season 0-3, I'm going to be pretty darn close to full panic mode for this team, because it's not looking good. It's not only that they're losing in ways that I think is scary, and that's something to keep in mind. But for Fnatic, again, it's a really nice start to the year. I think they look better than I ever anticipated them looking, and honestly, on this pace, they could even be one of the teams that competes for a finals, appearance or a championship, right? A winter split championship, because they are playing at such a high level. Really like what Fnatic's doing, and I think, maybe we're going to be looking at this year instead of the year of G2 is the year that Fnatic ends up, recouping that championship. And then moving on to our final game of day 2 here. This was a battle between 2 teams looking for their first win of the season. It was Rogue taking on Team Heretics. And Heretics is going to be able to pick up the win here. Rogue continuing to look just disastrous. Honestly, we're only 2 games in, but I feel like I'm completely out on this team. I feel like this team has shown absolutely nothing in the first 2 games, but Heretics actually looking really, really good here in game 2. Basically the flip of what happened in game number 1. They got absolutely destroyed by Mad to start off their season. They've remembered that they were good at League of Legends, and then they went out and played good League of Legends again. Now, maybe you would like to see them be a little bit more aggressive. Maybe you don't want to see them be as slow, but honestly, with the players on this team, I'm really not super concerned about that in a long-term sense. I think this is just a rebound. I think, game one was a little bit of an outlier. Sometimes you just get destroyed in the first 5 to 10 minutes of the game and you can't come back, and that's what it is. But, I think this team is still going to be fine, and I think this game is really a prime example as to why. I think a lot of these players actually played really well, and it's the players you wanted to see play well. Maybe not so much like Perks. You're still waiting on Perks to kind of get back into form and really look good. He didn't make any mistakes this game, which is good, but it was GIANTX, and it was my player of the game, Kaiser. And I know GIANTX got player of the game on broadcast. To me, this was a no-brainer. 100% KP on the Bard. Those ultimates were actually fantastic. This was the best game that Kaiser has played since, middle of 2022. It truly was that good. 2023 was a disaster year for him on Vitality. Everything went wrong for that team and for him individually, and he did not look good in that first game, but this was classic Kaiser. I know what we think of him is the engaged player, the Nautilus, the Alistair, the Rel, that style of engaged champion in the support position, but he's always been good on enchanters as well, most especially the Bard. And Bard's really more of a playmaker enchanter than he is enchanter anyways, and so this still fits kind of Kaiser's ideology of wanting to be able to really make some plays in the mid game, take over these 3v3s, and really start to push the tempo forward. He was awesome in this game. Kaiser was terrific, and if he's going to play like this, Heretics is going to be a very dangerous team, because my biggest concern on this team was Kaiser, was his ability to bounce back after what was genuinely just a really bad year last year on Vitality. You can talk about how Perks, ended off the year really poorly, but he showed flashes of being good last year. Wunder looked good when he was allowed to play last year. GIANTX was obviously very good on a bad Heretics team. Flakked looked good once he came back up to the LEC. It was Kaiser that I was most concerned about with this team actually being, a top-tier team in this league. And, Kaiser looked the best here in game 2. It's just a great thing. GIANTX also looked really good. This was a really big jungle gap in this game over Marcoon, and it is good to see GIANTX feel a little bit more comfortable. He got completely mental boomed in game number 1. You could see it not only on his face, but in his gameplay, where it's just okay, man, you clearly have given up on this game, so it's good to see him, mentally bounce back. I'm not worried about the mental resilience of GIANTX. That's not really something that I'm concerned about. We know that he can play these long series even when things aren't going well, but, it's good to see it on the Rift with this, collection of players. It's good to see him bounce back here on day 2. Flakked was solid on the Varus, being able to capitalize on a lot of what Bard was doing. Wunder looked really good on the incredibly strong Cassante, and Perks was there on the Akali, which I still think is not, a particularly impressive pick over the course of the LEC so far, but, in general, I think Heretics just looked very good in this game, and they did it against a bad Rogue team, so, we're going to have to see what they're going to do on day 3, but, man, I'm scared for Rogue. I think I'm worried about this team potentially just being the worst team in the LEC. I think that's very much a possibility. This was a miserable game from them, and that kind of comes off the back of another miserable game against SK earlier on in the week. Yes, SK is a good team, but, it's not looking good. The sit back and do nothing allegations are not being beaten at all by this team. I mean, they play so ridiculously slow, and, I guess you could kind of believe that from the team that they've assembled. Marcoon, not exactly the most early game jungler. Larson, certainly not the most early game mid laner. The kind of core of this team, the players that I really liked, they're a lot more of the late game scaling, team fight oriented types of players, and it's really not working for them. I think not having any of that early game pressure has hurt them a ton. Somebody's going to need to switch up their style. I think they're talented enough to be able to do that, but I gotta see them do it. Marcoon is going to get my dud of the game because the tempo is just absolutely not there from the jungle position. You need to be at least relevant coming out of that spot, and it just doesn't feel like he has been in the first 2 games. GIANTX completely out-jungled him in this one on the Maokai. He just kind of got behind and then eventually lost the game, and that's frustrating. I think you need to see some level of aggression, some level of playmaking and proactivity coming out from him, or else this team is going to be doomed. As much as I like him as a player, it might not be a very good fit. Comp and Zoelis really were also not good this game. Flakked and Kaiser completely gapped them in lane and out of lane. Kaiser was just dominant in terms of those ultimates, and Flakked was significantly better than Comp. I'm very concerned. Shigenda looks bad on the top side. Larson is, he's a good player. He's not going to lose super hard, which he hasn't yet, but he's also not the type of player that can salvage a bad team. That's just not who he is. That's not the kind of mentality that he has as a player. And so, yeah, could Rogue be one of the worst teams, if not the worst team in the LEC? Absolutely. Right now, they absolutely look like it. They're probably the team through the first 2 games, maybe outside of Vitality, that looks the worst in the LEC. They still have one more game, but it's against G2 on the final day, so it's not exactly the easiest challenge for them, but, you know, potentially you could show something there that could make things a little bit more interesting. But for Heretics, this was a very necessary win. I think a lot of people were, you know, obviously, you know, reactionarily, preemptively writing off Heretics as, oh, it's boomers and they're never going to be able to adapt. The Zoomers are going to gap them every single game. Perk sucks, Kaiser sucks, etc. You know, it was one game. I think seeing them bounce back really solidly here against Rogue is nice, but I need to see them beat like an actually good team in order for me to feel genuinely confident. You know, we're going to see what they have to offer on the 3rd and final day. If they walk out of this week 2-1, I think I'm going to feel at least a little bit better about it, but this is exactly the rebound to, I guess, what you needed after what was a horrendous day number 1. Now we get to jump into our final day of games here in week number 1, day number 3 in the LEC, and we got to kick it off with another BDS game. This time it's them taking on Team Vitality, and BDS is going to pick up their 2nd win of the week, and they're going to force Vitality to start the year 0-3. Certainly not the start that I think Vitality was looking for. This team looks absolutely disastrous. Arguably the worst team in the league. I mean, Rogue is right there. You know, we'll talk about some other teams as we get further along, but Vitality has really not looked good at all in week number 1. Basically, every, you know, positive thing that you could say about them in the preseason has not been able to come true at the beginning of the year for them here. And while, you know, there's one player on this team that I think is playing incredibly well, the rest of this team has just been an absolute disaster. Poor Photon is so hard stuck on the top side of this map because everybody else on this team is a bottom tier player at the current moment, specifically jungle and bot lane. VTO is fine. He's not really making a ton of like major errors. He's just not winning games for this team, but Douglas, Karzi, and Hylissang have just not been there. They've just not been good enough at the start of the split. But for BDS, that's their 2nd win. Their only loss this week was to G2. Certainly not a bad week. I mean, really, this is kind of exactly how you would want week 1 to go in a realistic way. Beating G2 would have been a big shock, but I mean, you can't sit here and say that walking out of this week 2-1 is a bad thing, really, at all. I think, especially in the second half of the week, they started playing a lot better. I'm pretty impressed with the bot lane. I think that it's been a lot better than maybe I anticipated it to be. It's certainly been better than I think a lot of other analysts anticipated it to be. I saw some players ranking BDS as number 10 in the power rankings. That was an absurd thing to do, but them coming out of the week at 2-1, I think is pretty strong. Player of the game was pretty up for debate for me. There were 2 really good options in this game. I ended up giving it to Sheo in the jungle. I felt like he was the most active member of the team, and it does kind of make up for the fact that he didn't really play well against G2 earlier in the week. He was the one that kind of got run around the most, I would argue, of anybody in that game, but this has been much better. He had a really good game 2. He had an even better game number 3 here. Xin Shao's actually looking to be a pretty strong pick. We've seen it really succeed at this level a couple of times. It's not been perfect. We've seen if you pilot it poorly or if you get behind early, it can be pretty difficult to get yourself back into games. But for the most part, Xin Shao has actually looked really effective in the LEC in week number 1, and Sheo, I think, piloted it really well in this game. I think as long as you're active in the early game, as long as you can get your laners ahead, Xin Shao's going to be great setup in the back half. That ultimate is like shockingly very, very good, not only for the immunity, but for the displacement that it offers. And I think generally speaking, the champion, you know, has a lot of tools. It has a lot of things in its kit that makes it very useful for most parts of the game. I think obviously it's nice to see Nuke have a really good game. He was the other player that I really, you know, kind of thought between giving player of the game to. Nuke was just really solid here. Damage on Azir can really go crazy. That champion is still in a really strong state. We're going to be seeing a lot of scaling mid laners. I think that's going to be more of the common trend as we move further along into this patch. You know, we've been seeing things like the Corki rise in popularity in regions like Korea. I'm not sure that's going to translate to a region like the LEC that really wants to dominate from snowballing and from early leads, but you know, something like Azir, I think, offers a bit of both. You can still lane relatively effectively because of your range and your poke ability. You have decent wave clear, especially once you start getting some levels, but you're also obviously a hyper carry in the late game if you are able to get some gold under you. I thought Nuke played relatively well here, definitely outplayed VTO in terms of effectiveness, and this was kind of a jungle mid-win for BDS, which is really nice to see. Adam was solid on the top side, played Sion, and didn't really have to do a whole ton. Photon was probably the better top laner in this game, if we're being entirely honest, which we will get to, but, you know, Adam certainly didn't make any mistakes, and I think Ice and Labrov are definitely better than what I thought they were going to be. I already like Labrov a lot. I've praised Labrov as a player quite a lot. Last year, I thought he was really underrated in terms of what he offered to this BDS team, one of the more valuable players to this team last year. I just didn't know how it was going to work with Ice. I wasn't a huge fan of him, but, you know, we talked about it. The zero tenacity Korean 80 carries coming into the LEC have a pretty good track record, Noah being the other one, of course, and Ice has come in and been really good for this team. He has not been a superstar by any means. He's not necessarily come in and like changed games and they're not playing through him, and he's not dominating in the same way that at times Crownie was doing for this team last year, but he's honestly been fine. He's been really good in the isolated 2v2. He played Jin Karma in this game and they won, which is certainly a surprise, but you know, I think Ice has honestly overperformed my expectations here in week number 1, and that will definitely be taken into account. But BDS looked good and they looked good all week. I think this was generally a positive week 1 for them. And then for Vitality, like I said, just a disaster. This might be the single worst team in the LEC at the current moment, which sucks because Photon is really good. And, you know, I told you guys in the preseason, in the offseason, that Photon was one of my favorite players in the LEC, came in as my number 2 top laner. I debated putting him at number 1 and putting Broken Blade at number 2 on that list. And while Photon's not a perfect player, we're really seeing why, you know, I have so much hype in him. And I think, you know, not just me, I think a lot of other people have a lot of hype in him. I think if he were on a genuinely good team, he could be the MVP of the league. He was my Winter Split MVP in 2023 when he joined the league. I think Photon has been that good, but it just doesn't matter. The rest of this team is an absolute disaster. It's literally 1v9ing at the current moment. And like I said, it's specifically jungle and bot lane that have just not been able to live up to expectation. Done of the game is no brainer. Gonna go to Hylissang. Do we remember when Hylissang's Rakan was like permabannable? 0-7-1. We have come pretty far. This is not a good look. When you get your signature champion as a player, I mean, Pyke is kind of there for Hylissang, but I mean, Rakan really is his signature champ. When Hylissang gets that and completely runs it against a team that a lot of people think is closer to mid than they are to top tier, that's a really, really bad sign. This was the worst game he has played this split, and that's saying something because his bot lane lost every single game all week long. Carzzy continues to be really bad, just have no impact on the game. His positioning continues to be incredibly lackluster, probably the worst of all the 80 carries in the LEC in week number 1. It just isn't looking good. Douglas has been gapped in every single game that they have played, and that's terrifying. I mean, he's not inting, he's not completely throwing the game away, but like, he's offering nothing positive towards this team. Like I said earlier, VTO's not really doing anything. He's kind of just sitting there and letting the rest of the team lose. I'm not exactly sure what he would do in this instance, but he's not really, you know, going out there and winning lane or really dominating. He's just going even, and then the rest of his team is getting bodied, so they're losing games. At least Photon is winning on the top side. That's something you can hang your hat on, something that you could theoretically play for if things got better elsewhere. But right now, I'm very concerned about Vitality. I think Douglas is just not good enough to play at the LEC level. That was a take that I had in the offseason, and that has very much come true, at least so far. I think Carzzy and Hylissang are in their bad state. Hopefully they can figure that out before the end of winter, but this could absolutely be a bottom 2 team, a team that doesn't make the group stage if things continue like this. It's just been a disaster. It's been worst case scenario for Vitality. I mean, I compared them to Excel. I didn't think they would take that comparison so literally. They very well could be the 10th place team if they continue to play like this. And then for BDS, you know, it's solid. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say they had the best week of all time or the worst week of all time. It was just a good week. This is kind of a middle of the pack week for a team that I would consider to be middle of the pack. But if Ice specifically continues to get better, I think Adam can win on the top side. Nuke had a good game here. Sheo seems to be getting back into form. I like Labrov. There are good players on this team. Do I think that they are guaranteed to be like a top 4 team and make the playoffs right now? Certainly not. I think there's a lot of competition for those spots, but BDS has proven that they at least deserve to be mentioned in that same category, and, you know, we'll see how they continue to move along with some tougher competition in week 2. Moving on to game number 2 of the final day here, and we were bound to get one wild game. Honestly, up until this point, the LEC had been far too predictable, and it's the LEC. We know that can't be the case, and so now we get into G2 taking on Rogue, and of course, Rogue ends up winning this game. I mean, truly, who went into this game not thinking Rogue was going to win? I said out loud at the time, Rogue's winning this. Before draft, it didn't matter, right? Like, G2 is going to drop a game, and that's how I know that Rogue is bad, by the way. This is confirmation bias that Rogue is not a good team, because if Rogue was a good team, they wouldn't have beaten G2 here. That's how this works. G2 only loses, you know, once or twice a split, and it's always to bad teams, and so this is not a good look for Rogue, obviously. Jokes aside, this is a pretty good game from them. They actually played really well. I think basically everybody on the team stepped up and kind of reminded us why a lot of these players were really highly regarded before the year started. And for G2, this felt like a pretty classic, like, mental lapse game where they just didn't take it seriously and they ended up getting absolutely destroyed by it. You know, they limit tested. That's, I guess, the verbiage, the wording that we will use is they were limit testing. So let's talk about it. Player of the game for me was actually pretty up in the air. I think Broadcast ended up giving it to Comp. Pretty rightfully so. The guy went 11-0-8 on Varus, which is pretty darn good, but to me it was between Larssen and Zoalise. I think one of those two were definitely the most important members of the team this game. I think Larssen definitely earned it, but I'm going to give it to Zoalise because I think he also very much earned it, and honestly, he was more noticeable in my eyes. The recon engages were really good this game. I felt like he had a really good idea of when he wanted to go in and what he wanted to do with it. And this is the kind of performance that you wanted to see on a team full of veterans, a team full of players that, you know, for the most part are, you know, middle tier players trying to make a great team work as a unit. You have this rookie that's come in and supposedly tried to raise the ceiling or the floor of this team alongside Comp. And, you know, it kind of worked in this game. Zoalise was really, really good. And if he's going to be a primary playmaker for this team, I actually do think that opens up some opportunities for the rest of this team to do something. A lot of what we've been complaining about with Rogue through the first two games is just their lack of playmakers, their lack of aggressive players in the early parts of the game. Marcoon and Larssen are both scalers. They're both kind of known for that. Shigenda is pretty good in lane, but is pretty inactive outside of that, and Comp has just not been good in any phase of the game for about half a year now. And so if Zoalise can be a playmaker that you can, you know, reliably count on to step up in most games, that's actually going to be a pretty big game changer, I would say, for Rogue. Moving into the future, it was a really encouraging game to see him come up and really just play as well as he did. But Larssen was the main damage carry in this one. I know a scoreline doesn't reflect that because Comp got all the kills, but Larssen really was the one that was kind of gapping Caps in the mid lane, and you know, he would continue to go on and dominate a lot of the team fights in the back half to be able to close it out. This is the kind of Larssen performance that you're a lot more used to, is, you know, a solid, steady early game. His opponent ended up inting into him, so it accelerated him a bit, but a solid, if unspectacular, early game that leads into a really dominant Azir performance in team fights. That's Larssen. That is his MO, and that's what he's always going to be for this team. You know, he'd been a little bit inconsistent at the beginning of games in the start of the split up until this point, but it's nice to see that the consistent part of him is still there, even if, you know, the rest of his team isn't necessarily going to be able to get him to that part nearly as easily. Comp did play well. I want to make a note of it. You don't go 11-0-8 on Varus by accident. He was really good this game, and he took advantage of a lot of mistakes that Mickey X ended up making on the rel in this one. But, you know, I don't think Comp was the primary damage threat this game. I think that was Larssen. I think Zoalise was the one stepping up. Marcoon and Shigenda were fine. They didn't really have to do a whole ton on the top side of the map. They certainly were better than their opposition, if only because the team had a lot of pressure, and they were able to just kind of play really active. Again, another win for Xinjiao. Something to keep in mind. Another win for Cassante, something to keep in mind, but you know, it was just a solid game from Rogue. They clearly had an idea of how they wanted to play, and Zoalise went out and executed on it. Larssen did his thing, and Comp, you know, had a good game. When Comp plays well, this team wins. That was kind of the thing with Koi last year. I don't see any reason to say anything else now. And then for G2 on the other side, I'm not surprised. I mean, this is pretty standard for them. They do this every single year. If anybody came into this game not expecting G2 to at least struggle, then I don't really know what you're thinking. This is just who G2 is. They don't take the bottom tier teams seriously. They always limit test against them, and they always end up living to regret it. It just kind of is what it is. I remember when they gave over the one win of the split to BDS in 2022. It's part of the cycle. It's part of the LEC mantra that G2 has to give over a win to one of the bottom tier teams. But, you know, I'm not going to freak out. Caps had a miserable game. He was awesome through the first 2 days, though, when he felt like he was actually trying, when they were going up against teams that they were clearly motivated to go out and try and beat. Caps was the best player on the Rift in those games, going up against this Rogue team that had looked absolutely disastrous up until this point. Caps didn't feel the need to try, and of all the champions that have been limit testing champions for Caps in the past, it feels like Nico is kind of the, you know, the pinnacle of what that is. Not only this year, but last year as well. It feels like every single time he picks this champion in the regular season, you can just find him randomly at 20 minutes just doing something very funny on the map that isn't necessarily effective towards winning games, but is very funny, and something that I think, you know, it's a concentration, it's a focus thing, but honestly, I'm fine with it, especially if he's going to play as well as he did in the first 2 weeks. You would like to see him not just randomly throw games away. He is dud of the game, but you know, you can live with it. He was really, really good through the first 2 weeks. You can kind of excuse him for taking a little bit off of the Rogue game, but Mickey X was also really bad in this one, got completely gapped by Zoalise on the other side. Not really something you expected to hear before, you know, a game like this, but Again, G2 loves to limit test. They love to just throw away games. Yike got gapped. Broken Blade had no impact. Hansama was nothing in this game on the Aphelios. There really just wasn't a lot going for G2. This was a bad performance from them, but you chalk it up to the fact that they, are G2 and they were going up against Rogue. I know I'm repeating myself over and over again, so I'll just end it with this. G2's probably still going to be the #1 team in my power rankings by the end of this video. And then for Rogue, it's a nice win. It's really good to not go into week number 2 0-3. That's definitely a demoralizing way to start the split, but I honestly don't think this changes my perception of the team all that much in terms of strength. I still think they're going to be one of the weaker teams in the LEC, one of the teams that is kind of on the cusp of potentially being one that misses out on the playoffs, especially with their schedule potentially getting harder. I don't think it's going to get better for Rogue, and I think this might be a bright spot amidst a really bad split, but hopefully they can take some of the confidence that they were able to garner from this win and translate it into something else and something different in week 2. And now moving on to our third game of the final day here. It's a battle between 1-1 teams, both looking to go above 500 at the end of the week. It's GIANTX taking on Team Heretics, and Heretics is going to pick up their second win in a row here. They're going to move to 2-1, and this is the win I was looking to see. I talked about it on day 2. I really needed to see them come out on day 3 and look really good against a GIANTX team that I just don't have a ton of expectation on, and they did just that. They were able to come out. They controlled the pace of this game. They, quite frankly, just mechanic checked a lot of their opponents, and they were able to come out on top in a pretty strong victory. I think basically everybody on the team ended up playing well in this one, specifically 3 players, but I want to say that, everybody on the team is playing well. There is nobody who has played poorly on this team over the last 2 games, and I think that was abundantly clear. For GX, this is a bit of a reality check, I think, for them. I think there was a lot of hype surrounding them after that first game against Vitality, but after what we've seen from Vitality, maybe they were more bad rather than GX being good. They almost threw that ridiculous lead after all, and so, I'm still not sold on this team really at all. It feels like a top 5 or 6 in the LEC right now, and then a bottom 4, and GX is absolutely a part of that bottom 4, in my opinion. But let's talk about Heretics first and foremost. Player of the game is once again going to go to Kaiser in the support position. He is back. Honestly, I'm pretty confident in saying that this is going to be a complete rejuvenation year for Kaiser. Was obviously really bad in that first game against Mad Lions, but everybody on the team was really bad in that first game against Mad Lions. In both of the games that he has played on Bard, Games 2 and 3 of this week, he has 100% kill participation, and he has been essentially perfect as a playmaker. He has been so active, so creative in terms of how he is able to get his team involved, and also just generally, he has been very, very good. His mechanics have been very solid. The ultimates have been very solid. The 2 Bard games are very inspiring, and honestly, that's not even his best champion. I think if the meta does move in favor of more engagers, we see the Rakan on the other side of this matchup. If that moves to things like Rakan or Nautilus or Alistair, or anything in that vein, Thresh, anything in that vein, I think Kaiser is going to be even better on this team. It always felt like a confidence thing with him as a player, and it's really good to see that with him kind of getting his confidence back here in the, at the beginning of the season with a genuinely good team surrounding him, he can actually go back to potentially being the best support in the LEC. That title, outside of Mickey X is pretty up for grabs. I mean, I gave it to Hillisang, you could give it to Lebrav, but neither of those players are locked in there at all, and Hilly's been awful at the start of the year. Kaiser has a very easy case to be made that even after week 1 here, he's the second best support in the LEC. That's how open that race is, and so really good to see him back into form, and this is the perks that I was seeing last year. This is the perks I told everybody not to worry about. This was a little bit of a welcome to the league moment for Jackies. We will talk about that when we get there. This kind of was a welcome to the big leagues kid moment from Perks, but he just absolutely dominated that laning phase. The Akali. This was the best Akali I think we saw all weekend, and that's saying something because I actually think the Akali was, pretty good in a lot of these games. It just wasn't perfect. I think this was the most dominating Akali performance we saw all weekend. Wunder was awesome on the top side of this map. He made Otawamne look like a kid in that matchup, look like Jackies, look like a rookie, and that's not really what you want to see if you're GX. Overall, it was everybody. Flacket is hyper consistent in the bot lane. He's basically the perfect, weak side bot laner in the LEC. He does exactly what he is told. He plays whatever role he is supposed to play, and he can play them all at a high level. He can carry games. He can play weak side. He can do whatever you need him to do. Just a very valuable player, and Yankos was honestly the least valuable player on the team in this game, and that really says something because it's a Yankos, and he's always valuable just purely by his shot calling alone. This was a really good effort, and this does, again, inspire me on Heretics. We talked about how I wasn't super worried about that day 1 loss because it was one of those games that just snowballed so far out of control. That's a remake angle if you're scripted scrimming, right? That's just kind of how it ends up going. But when Heretics is allowed to play their game is actually pretty damn good. And I think they're going to win a lot of them. And I think this was a good example of that. And then for GX on the other side, this team's just not very good. I was probably right when I ranked them 9th. I'm not sure if they're going to stay at 9. They might even go up just because the bottom of the LEC is so bad right now, but they're certainly in the conversation for being in that sphere. You know, like I said, it really does feel like a bottom 4 in the LEC right now, and GX very much is a part of that. This was not a good performance. Jackie's is going to get out of the game. Like I said, kind of got, you know, welcome to the big league here by Perks. He got big leagued by, you know, probably the second best mid in the history of this region, and it's okay. You can live with that. You're hoping Jackie's can develop quickly. I don't think a lot of people were expecting a lot from him as a player early on. It was really nice to see some signs of him being, you know, a little bit better than maybe we expected in the first couple of games, being able to delay on a champion like Nico, but that was taken away very early in the draft by Heretics, and Jackie's didn't really seem to have a backup plan. Gonna be interesting to see if that continues to be a ban for teams against GX, but he was not very good this week. I don't think Patrick played particularly well in this game. This was probably his worst game of the week up until this point. He had actually been good, and Otawamne got completely gapped on the top side. Wonder was absolutely the better top laner of the two in this matchup. Overall, GX just looked outclassed. Even if Peach had a couple of moments where he was trying to generate pressure, Ignar wasn't exactly a disaster in this game. Like, I don't really see a lot of avenues for this team to consistently be able to win games. I like Patrick, and he's been able to win games for this team, but Odo really hasn't been himself so far in the first 3 games of this split. I'm still very concerned about the mid-jungle duo. It's really going to have to be bot lane stepping up, in my opinion, to very consistently win, and I just don't know how many teams you're actually going to be able to do that against if you are GX, and so am I concerned about this team? Yes, I don't think they're going to be a top-tier team, but do I think they could pick up some wins and be a team that's better than bottom 2? I think they probably should be in that zone. Obviously, we'll have to see. There's going to be some big matchups next week that kind of determine whether or not GX can be better than that, or perhaps even worse than what I'm projecting, but right now, they just seem like a below-average team, a team that's going to be an easy exit and a dream draw in the group stage, coming out as the 7 or the 8 seed, and then for Heretics on the other side, I still think this team is very, very legit. I would expect this team to keep growing. I know obviously it's a weird thing to say because they played together before, but I would expect them to get better. They had a pretty poor read on the meta at the beginning of the week. I think that got better as the week went on, and honestly, their confidence just went up. I think they're going to get more experience the more they play together, and generally, I think they're going to end this year pretty strong. And, you know, they came in at number 2. Some people might have not wanted to see that. I got a comment, like, on day 1 of the LEC, like, right after things started, where it was like, and that's why you were overrating Perks and Heretics, and it's like, let's calm down. Let's wait for more than that, and I think I still feel pretty similar to how I felt about Heretics even after the dominating loss. I think this is a good team, and especially with Kaiser playing so well, I think this could actually be a team that contends for the LEC title. And then moving on to game number 4 now, and man, this is the match of the week. I don't really care what anybody else says. This was the match of the week. This was always going to be the match of the week. I can't talk about, you know, hype experiences without talking about Corp taking on Mad Lions. And Mad Lions actually being able to pick up the win. I should specify Mad Lions Koi, because that's very important towards why this was the match of the week. If you're not familiar with, you know, why this was the match of the week for me and everybody else, then, you know, congratulations, you're not on Twitter, and I really respect that, but let's just say the fan bases are very passionate. This became much more than just a regular season matchup. This was France versus Spain in the purest of forms, and I'm certainly not taking a side, but Mad definitely came out on top in this one. They were the better team by a pretty considerable margin. They were able to win in a pretty consistent manner, and honestly, this Mad Lions team is very fun to watch. I think they are a very, very cool team, and I think they're playing well. Corp, on the other hand, you know, there are pieces to this team that work. I think a couple of these players had, you know, pretty decent games, and they've had pretty decent starts, but a couple of other players have just simply not been good enough to play at the LEC level, and that's certainly something that we will talk about. Let's start with Mad, of course, as we do with winning teams. Player of the game for me, pretty obviously, is going to go to Supa in the bot lane. When you get a pentakill in your first ever week in the LEC, you're probably going to get at least one player of the game, and I think he deserved it in this one. What a really good Aphelios game. We've seen this champion kind of be mediocre so far in the LEC. We've seen a couple of bot laners really kind of stand out, Kalista being the one that was the most notable for me for being really successful, but the Aphelios I think is still a strong pick. It's very consistent, and you know, a lot of these AD carries have a lot of experience and time on the Aphelios, and so for Supa to be able to pick it up here and for him to just dominate in the way that he did, I mean, he wasn't the only player on this team to be able to generate leads, but that pentakill in the back half of the game was all him. His positioning was super good. You can give a lot of credit to Elyoya, who really did set a lot of it up as well, and Alvaro, who had a really good game and who has been playing phenomenal in the first week here, but Supa was the guy, and he definitely deserved player of the game. A player that, you know, I crowned as a very early favorite for Rookie of the Year, obviously. Isma is really good. His former teammate on Movistar is really, really good and probably is holding the lead for that right now, but Supa is certainly not far behind. Maybe Alvaro is ahead of him as well, but both of them have been absolutely terrific. This bot lane has been everything I could have wanted to see out of them and then some. They've translated to the LEC incredibly well. Obviously, help from one of the more consistent junglers in the entire league is going to do that for you, but you still have to be able to go out there and perform mechanically, and I think Supa and Alvaro have both been able to do that. Great game from Elyoya on this Sejuani. Love him on this champion. Really, really fun to watch, and then solo lanes were big gaps. This was Merwin's best game in the LEC by a large margin in the first week. Really haven't said his name, like, at all for MDK. They've not played towards topside, but he got to pick something a bit more aggressive in this game number 3, and this was a top gap. Make absolutely no mistake about it. This was a pretty massive top gap. Even mid was a pretty big gap. Frescoe was pretty good this game, but overall MDK looking really good based off of their bot lane with their jungle supporting and their top lane looking really good in this game number 3. And honestly, this is a good team. This isn't just an average team. I talked about there being kind of a clear bottom 4 in my eyes right now in the LEC. MDK's not in that. They are absolutely not. They feel like one of the top 6 teams at the current moment, a team that, you know, given the right infrastructure, could potentially make top 4 if everything goes right. And for that to be the case in winter already, that's crazy. It's looking really good for this team. And then for Corp on the other side, I don't really know what to tell you. This is just not working out for them. The unfortunate part is it's the parts of the team that you really wanted to see do well. It's not Upset. It's not even really Targamas, although Targamas wasn't particularly good in this game, missing a ton of Ashe arrows. It's the solo laners. It's the 2 players that are really kind of Corp for life, if you will. The players who have been playing in this organization, in the ERLs, in the LFL for a long time. They're the players that have just not been able to adapt early on in this split. Seiken is a complete non-factor. His score lines aren't atrocious, but that's also because he's just gracefully losing by 40 CS every game. And that's really something you can't get away with in the LEC. Fresco, he's not even one of the top mid laners in the region. For you to be losing as hard as you were individually in lane to that, it's just not a good sign. And to have such little impact in the back half of the game, it's concerning. But dud of the game easily is going to go to Cabochard in the top lane. He was really bad this week. I mean, he had no impact on the Gragas in the late game in game 1. He was awful in game number 2, and he might have even been worse here in game number 3. He had no impact on the Malphite in game 2. This Jax game was just bad, and Jax is such a strong champion in the meta right now. Cabo just looks completely overmatched at this level, if I'm being entirely honest. I hope I'm wrong. I hope this is just week 1 jitters. We saw it last year with Oscar Ridden in the spring split. Sometimes, you know, getting called up and, you know, adjusting to a new level of competition, especially at a position like top lane, which is just so stacked at the LEC level. It's hard to do super quickly, but he's going to have to figure it out because this team is 0-3 now. They have started their split without a win in week number 1 with all the expectation, with all the hype, with all of the things that were surrounding Corp coming into the league here finally. For them to start 0-3, it's a pretty big disaster, and quite frankly, it is a bit off the backs of their solo laners. Bo was not very good through the first 2 games. He was a lot better here in game number 3, though. I want to make that clear. This was a pretty good game from him, and in a lot of other circumstances, this would have actually been a pretty successful game for Bo. They just didn't have it. Upset continues to be the best player on this team, though, and it feels like Upset is pretty hard stuck. Nobody else in this team has been consistent at all, and I don't really know what they're going to do to change that. If they get gapped 1v1 in lane every game, they're just not going to win a lot of games. That really is the truth of it, but there are bright spots to this Corp team, which is at least something that I can say that hopefully they can turn it around. It was a hard week. It was 2 of the best teams in the LEC, and then Mad, who has obviously been pretty interesting, been a surprise, but you have to be better next week. Your schedule is going to be more forgiving. You got to live up to that. And then for MDK on the other side, 2-1 start, that's pretty darn good. This is a team that, you know, is pretty much expecting themselves to make group stage. I think everybody pretty much expected themselves to make group stage going into the LEC this year, but they've looked even better than I anticipated. I think everybody has looked solid in their own way, but the bot lane and the jungle position, I think, could be really deadly, and if Merwin continues to look good, even against top laners that aren't struggling at the current moment, like Cabochard is, like, Mad could actually be a scary team. I don't want to pull the trigger entirely on them yet, because there were a lot of circumstances that led to both of their wins this week, but it's about as good of a showing as you could have, given the circumstances surrounding their 2024 so far. And that's going to lead us into our final game of week number 1 here, our last game of day number 3, and it was a banger, a battle between 2-2-0 teams. One of them will be walking out of this week undefeated. It was Fnatic taking on SK Gaming, And SK Gaming are the only team in the LEC to walk out of week number 1 3-0. If I had told you that at the beginning of the year, you certainly would not have believed me, but I love this team. I'm all in on SK at the current moment. I think this is entirely sustainable, and I don't know how much you're going to hear that from other analysts, but I think the way that they are winning is something that I truly believe in. I think there are certain lanes that are just simply better than the others. Really, the only lane I have any question mark about, or the only position I have any question mark about, is jungle, and he was arguably the most impactful player on the team this week. I think everybody else at this point, I feel very confident, is going to at the very least be in the upper echelon of their position in the league, and if jungle is going to be top as well, then, I mean, you might be looking at the best team in the LEC right now. That's how good SK is playing. No disrespect to Fnatic either. They played really well on the first 2 days, and I still am very excited about this team, but you know, they were just not enough for SK, who just feels unstoppable through the first 3 games of the season. Obviously, I don't want to overreact. I don't want to sit here and tell you that SK is going to win the LEC or anything like that, but I think there's a lot of reason to believe that this is legit from them. This isn't a one-week wonder. I think this team is going to be very good this year, but let's talk about it. Player of the game, Irrelevant. Oh my god, what a game, and what a week generally from Irrelevant. I didn't speak about him nearly as much as maybe I should. Game number 1 was solid from him, but it was really Isma and then Niski that were really good. Game number 2, it was, you know, Isma being really good and Exakick getting really far ahead, but Irrelevant also playing well. And then in game 3, it was all Irrelevant on his signature Jax. This is the champion that he really grew to prominence on Misfits back in the day, back in 2022. I know a lot of people don't remember that team, but that was a big fan favorite of mine. It was a team I really invested a lot in with that VTO Neon Irrelevant kind of core that I really liked on that roster, and Irrelevant has just grown every single split since then, and there is an argument to be made that he's the best top laner in the LEC right now. Now, I'm not going to make that argument just yet. It's so close. I want to see him go up against Broken Blade. I want to see him go up against Photon. Those are the guys I want to see him beat, but you know, top 3, I'm right there. Like, I'm already right there. Adam is a good player, and you know, Odoamne is a very consistent player, but Irrelevant has been better than those guys over the beginning part of this split by a considerable margin. If he keeps this up, he's on, you know, borderline MVP pace, first team all-pro pace. That's kind of where he's at right now with SK, and I really think he deserves to get all of the praise that he is getting. It might be a little quick on the trigger to see some of the comments that I've seen about him saying he's guaranteed number 1, and there's no debate. He's absolutely the best top laner. I think he's close to that, and you know, another couple weeks of performances like this, especially against those guys that I rate very highly, and I'm gonna really start believing, but I do need to see that. This was a good week 1. If he can carry that into the rest, it's gonna be great. But Isma continues to be incredibly solid. His rel is really good. He has a really good mind for when to go in on champions like Rel, when to engage, when to be aggressive. That's something that honestly a lot of junglers just never learn in the mid to late game, is not only how to be a proactive and valuable player, but when to be a proactive and valuable player. But Isma had that in spades at the start of this, so, you know, really, really good stuff. Obviously, his week has been tremendous. Niski's had a great week. Exakick and DOS have very sneakily been amazing. This week, they have consistently won 2v2, basically without any sort of jungle intervention, basically every time they're asked. Isma has been down there a bit, but, you know, Draven was really good this game. Exakick is really solid, one of the best AD carries in the LEC, and DOS is more than stable as a support, especially because those two have very good chemistry together. This is a genuinely great team. A team that can compete, and a team that right now deserves to be the only undefeated team in the LEC. And then for Fnatic, you know, it's a rough loss. You probably didn't want to lose this. You probably wanted to end this week 3-0. I think a lot of people expected you to end this week 3-0 after you started 2-0 and you had this SK game, but, you know, there are still positives to take away. I think Razork played a relatively decent game. He was able to get a lot of gold onto the Kalista, which is generally a good idea if you're going to be playing for Kalista. Kalista has been the strongest AD carry in the meta so far in the LEC, in my opinion, and to see, you know, them go for that game plan, I think it works, especially if you're going to play with the Blitzcrank, but the solo lanes just were not there. Oscar Rinnan was absolutely gapped in this game. Easy choice for dead of the game. I like Oscar, but this is why I was pumping the brakes on the first 2 games, because while he is good, he is inconsistently very good. There are going to be games, especially against worse top laners, that look really good. I mean, he dominated Cabo Shard, but, you know, we've seen what Cabo has done the rest of this week. And then he goes up against a player in Irrelevant who's probably just better than him, and he kind of gets bodied. He also got taken off the Cassante, and that is a bit of a concern. He was really good on Cassante last year as well, but looked significantly worse on champions that weren't Cassante and Ornn to an extent. So I don't know. Do I really fully believe in Oscarinin? I still think he's a good player, but I'm still of half a mind to say that he's just a good player and, he's going to take a little bit to get to that great player status. I like his upside, but I think a lot of the people who were saying that he had already reached his potential after the first 2 games, I think just jumped the shark a tad bit. I still think he's going to be fine. Humanoid came back down to earth in this game. He got absolutely bodied by Niski in lane. This is kind of how the Nico Azir matchup ends up going. It's very Nico favored early on in the game, and so long as Humanoid ends up, or Niski ends up not misplaying it, I should say, Humanoid shouldn't really have any pressure so long as the game doesn't go late enough to get Azir back in, and Niski played it perfectly. Humanoid really had no pressure, and, it's a bit concerning, but again, it's Humanoid in the regular season. I'm really going to chalk up all of these performances, with a grain of salt, I guess I should say. June was kind of bad in this game on the Blitz. A lot of those hooks were miserable. He's never really been good at playmakers. I always liked him a bit more on the enchanters. That's kind of really the playstyle that I always thought he was more comfortable on. We'll see what he ends up doing, but he was the least valuable member of this team this week, and we'll see if that continues onwards. But overall, I'm not going to panic about Fnatic. This is still a really good team, and they showed so much on the first 2 days that was positive and really, they showed so much growth in those areas that it's hard for me to sit here and say that I'm still not walking out of week 1 feeling very good. I think they just wish they were walking out of week 1 feeling great, being the only team undefeated, but that's going to go to SK Gaming. Winter SK is here, and if they can keep it up, they're going to be very dangerous. They're basically 1 win away from auto-qualifying for the group stage after week 1, which is a pretty good position to be in, but I think they're thinking a lot bigger than that. This is a team that wants to be the #1 seed, and honestly has a pretty good shot of being able to get there. Their hardest games are still coming up, but Fnatic has been taken care of. If they can take care of the other top tier teams, who's to say SK can't actually surprise everybody and be a team that competes for a title this year? All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Winter Split Week 1 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. We went over all 15 games from all 3 days, and it's time to talk about my power rankings up on the screen right now. You're going to see the updated standings after 1 week of action here in the LEC. Of course, any ties will just be broken alphabetically. I'm not trying to show any favoritism towards any individual team, but there are a lot of ties. You can see it broken half and half. How this works, if you're new here, how this, what you're seeing on the screen is working at the moment. In the first column is my current power ranking for that team, where I rank them from 1 to 10 in my personal power rankings. In that second column where it says change, that's how they have changed from last week to this week. So a plus, 3 in SK's case would mean they've risen 3 spots. A -5 in Vitality's case means they've fallen 5 spots. I don't always just go based off of standings. I think you're going to see a lot of people that just make their power rankings a standings list in whatever order they feel most comfortable. That's not how I do things. I try to power rank these teams based on who I believe truly is going to be the best by the end of the regular season. Who do I think has the best shot of winning the LEC at the current moment, and in what order? That's what my power rankings are as the season continues to progress. And generally speaking, I'm a little bit slower on changes. I really don't want to overreact to one good week like SK had. They are going to move up quite a bit. They're going to get into that top 4, but I'm just not ready and comfortable to put them over the 2 teams that I think have a higher mechanical ceiling than them if everything ends up going right. So we'll talk about it now. Top of the standings top of the power rankings have not changed. G2 at 1, Heretics at 2, Fnatic at 3. Perhaps you could move these around. You could potentially put Fnatic at 2 and Heretics at 3. You could even put SK as high as 2, and I honestly would really believe that. I'm very flexible when it comes to 2 through 4, but this is how I ended up. SK is going to stay at 4, even though they beat Fnatic. I know that there are going to be maybe some people out there that find that kind of crazy, that Fnatic ends up staying higher than SK even after SK beat them, and beat them pretty handily, quite frankly, but honestly, I think by the end of the split, Fnatic's going to be the better team. They're still the team that I trust more in a clutch situation. Perhaps SK can prove me wrong. If they can go out and beat teams like, Heretics and like G2 as they face them later on in the season, then I'm definitely open to changing my mind. But for now, they're going to be comfortable being in the top 4, one of those playoff spots, which I still think is a pretty prestigious place to be. BDS sticks at 5, and then jumping into the top 6, it's going to be Mad Lions. I feel like there's a top 6 in the LEC right now, and a bottom 4. Mad Lions kind of rounds out that top 6. They could even go higher than that. They go up 4 spots here from number 10 to that number 6 spot. They're in that upper echelon of teams, in my opinion, but I still need to see just a tad bit more before I feel comfortable putting them above teams like BDS and SK Gaming and, in that same sphere, but they're very much on the trajectory to eventually get there. And then bottom 4, like I said, feel pretty locked in at the current moment. Coming in at 7, it's going to be GIANTX. I feel like their win was the most you know, I guess least controversial, but I don't trust this team at all. Rogue feels like a really bad team that got lucked into a win against G2, and then K-Corp and Vitality have yet to show us that they can win games. You know, GIANTX is actually moving up 2 spots because I had them very low at the start of the split, but bottom 3 felt pretty obvious to me. I don't think GX is the 7th best team or should be the 7th best team in the LEC based on how they've played, but bottom 3 feel very obvious. Rogue getting that win comes in at 8. Vitality dropping all the way down to number 9. That's 5 spots from 4 to 9. That's a big drop, and then K-Corp unfortunately being the team that takes that number 10 spot. I think anybody could have a turnaround. K-Corp had a very tough schedule, and honestly, Vitality might have looked a little worse than them in week number 1, but I think you can make the argument that Vitality is a team that you would expect to maybe be able to bounce back, whereas, you know, K-Corp solo laners just seem really out of their depth at the current moment. And so those are the power rankings, those are the standings, and we're going to move to kind of a new slide. We've obviously always done this on the channel, but it's my player of the week and my dud of the week. I've always talked about it in these videos, but I've never had a slide. I've never had a visual to kind of represent it. We're going to be, you know, kind of testing out different versions of this as we go throughout the year. I hope you guys enjoy it, and let me know what you guys think of it down in the comment section below as well. As you can see, my player of the week in week number 1 is going to go to Isma in the jungle position for SK Gaming. To me, this really was a no-brainer. If it wasn't Isma, it was probably going to go to Irrelevant, but I thought Isma was the player that they really played through, especially in the early game. Those level 3 ganks were incredibly important, and SK going on that magnificent 3-0 run with a win over Fnatic, it was a lot based off of Isma stepping up in the jungle. I think he was the worthy recipient, I should say, of player of the week in week number 1. I have some honorable mentions there as well. Kaiser getting an honorable mention. He is definitely somebody that I'm really interested to watch for. He had a great week outside of that first game, and you know, honestly, if he continues to play like he did on the Bard, that's going to be big because that's one of the best supports in the league. And then Caps is going to get an honorable mention. Again, outside of that Rogue game where everything just felt limit testy, he was awesome in the first 2 games. The game against BDS was really, really fun. And the game against K-Corp was also really good from Caps. And so, generally speaking, these are the 3 players that I think, you know, deserve the player of the week honorable mentions. Isma's getting it, but Kaiser and Caps are honorable mentions, if you will. And then, unfortunately, my dud of the week in week 1 is going to go to Cabochard. I just really couldn't justify giving it to anybody else. I think you could theoretically give it to either member of the Vitality bot lane, either Karzi or Hillisang. You could consider them the honorable mentions for dud of the week, but to me, Cabochard kind of stood out as the player that looked the most out of his depth in week number 1. We've seen this out of top laners. Sometimes you just have a bad week, especially when you're going in to other good top laners, but he's going to have to course correct incredibly quickly because this team really doesn't have a ton of room for error at this point. Starting over 3, you have to figure it out sooner rather than later, and to me, Cabo was the most outmatched player in week number 1, but would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on everything. Of course, let me know your player of the week, your dud of the week. What teams do you think I have too high? What teams do you think I have too low? Love to have those conversations down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We don't only cover the LEC on this channel. We cover all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL every single week, and everybody is kicking off right now. We had our big LCK primer video yesterday. We're going to have our big LCS primer video coming out tomorrow. And so a lot of content circulating around the sphere right now. I hope you guys are excited and interested. And if you are and you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do end up going live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all